Story 1.
My name is Max Nikolsky. I live in New York and study architecture. My life is quite ordinary and peaceful. In the morning, I attend lectures at the university where I study building design. After classes, I often stay in the library or student lounges, working on drawings and projects. My life is not full of adventures or incredible events, but I enjoy its calm rhythm. I appreciate simple joys, such as morning coffee, warm sunshine in the park, and time spent with loved ones. I like what I do, and I look forward to what the future holds. However, everything changed one day when my professor asked me to help him with a task that led me to the old, abandoned house of his deceased friend. Dr. Harrison was one of the most respected professors at our university. He specialized in the history of architecture and often told fascinating stories about old buildings and their owners. One day, after a lecture, he approached me and asked if I could help him over the weekend. "Max, I have a task that I can't complete alone," he said. "I need to visit the house of my old friend who recently passed away. The house is quite old and neglected, and I need to take inventory and clean up a bit. Could you accompany me?" I agreed, thinking it would be an interesting experience and an opportunity to get to know the professor better. We arranged to meet on Saturday morning at the main university building, from where we would drive to a small village outside the city where the house was located. On the appointed day, we met. The professor arrived in his old but well-maintained car. He told me that the house belonged to his friend, Mr. John Wilson, who was also passionate about history and collecting antiques. After Wilson's death, the house was abandoned, and now Harrison wanted to sort out the inheritance. On the way, the professor told interesting stories about his friend and the house itself. It was a large Victorian mansion built in the late 19th century. It was full of antique furniture and rare art objects. We drove for about 2 hours until we reached the village. The house stood on the outskirts, surrounded by a dense forest. From the road, its majestic but neglected appearance was already noticeable. We parked by the porch. The professor took a bunch of keys from the car and opened the massive wooden door. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust. I turned on my flashlight to light the way. We walked through a spacious hall with a high ceiling adorned with stucco and headed to the living room. The furniture was covered with white sheets, which had turned gray over time. In the corner stood a large fireplace, and above it hung a painting depicting an old ship in a storm. "Let's start with the living room," said the professor. "We need to remove the sheets, dust off, and inventory everything here." We began removing the sheets and stacking them in the corner. Underneath were beautiful carved chairs, tables, and chests of drawers. I took a cloth and started wiping the thick layer of dust off the furniture. The professor recorded each item in his notebook, occasionally telling me about its origin and value. We spent several hours cleaning the living room and adjacent rooms. In each, we found new interesting items, from old books to antique clocks. When we reached the kitchen, I noticed a staircase leading to the attic. "Professor, what's in the attic?" I asked. "Oh, there's a lot up there," he replied. "John often kept his most valuable finds there. We should check it out too." The attic intrigued me with its mystery. After we finished with the main rooms, I suggested going up there. The professor agreed, and we approached the staircase together. It creaked under our feet as we climbed up. The attic was even darker and colder than downstairs. I turned on my flashlight again to light the way. The attic was huge, with a low ceiling and massive wooden beams. There were many old boxes, trunks, and dusty covers. I began carefully sorting through the boxes, finding all sorts of items: old books, photographs, letters, and even some ancient artifacts. One trunk particularly caught my attention. It was locked with a massive padlock, and I called the professor to take a look. The professor approached and, smiling, said, "I remember this trunk. John always said it held something special. Let's try to open it." We searched for the key for a long time, but couldn't find it among the items in the attic. Then the professor suggested trying to pick the lock. With some effort, we managed to do it. When the trunk lid opened, we saw inside a collection of rare coins, jewelry, and ancient artifacts. "This is incredible," the professor said. John was truly an avid collector. Among all these ancient items, I suddenly noticed something unusual. In the corner lay a strange device. It looked like something between an old radio and a time machine from science fiction. The device was metallic, covered in the patina of time, with copper wires sticking out in all directions and small bulbs, some of which still glowed faintly. In the center of the device was a small screen displaying strange symbols resembling ancient runes. I called the professor to take a look. Harrison approached and his eyes lit up with interest. "Max, this is amazing. I've never seen anything like it." John was always fascinated by strange and rare things, but this exceeds all my expectations, he said. We were both engrossed in studying the device. I began cautiously pressing buttons and levers, trying to understand how it worked. The professor recorded his observations in his notebook, occasionally giving me advice and remarks. Suddenly, the device started emitting a strange hum, and the bulbs on it flickered brighter. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and suddenly a powerful electric discharge burst from the device. I didn't have time to understand anything as a strong electric shock struck me, and I lost consciousness. I woke up in a hospital. Opening my eyes, I saw a white ceiling and heard the quiet hum of medical equipment. My head felt a bit dizzy, and I felt weak. A doctor was standing next to me who noticed that I had come to my senses. "Good morning, Max. How are you feeling?" he asked. "Where am I?" "What happened?" I asked faintly. "You're in the hospital. You were brought here last night. Professor Harrison said you got an electric shock. We've done all the necessary tests, and fortunately, there are no serious injuries. You suffered a mild shock and lost consciousness," the doctor said reassuringly. A few minutes later, Professor Harrison entered the room. He looked worried, but when he saw that I was awake, he smiled with relief. "Max, how are you?" I was so worried. "After you lost consciousness, I immediately called an ambulance. They said you would be okay, but I was still concerned," he said. "Thank you, Professor. I feel a bit weak, but otherwise I'm fine." "What was that device?" I asked, trying to recall the details of the incident. "That's still a mystery, Max. I left the device in the attic and called the museum to send specialists. I think it's something really rare and possibly dangerous. But first you need to fully recover," he replied. The doctor approached us and said that I could stay in the hospital for a few more hours for observation. After being discharged, I returned home. The familiar walls of my cozy apartment in New York greeted me. I felt relieved to be back in a familiar setting. The first thing I did was settle on the couch to rest and collect my thoughts. Everything that had happened in the past couple of days seemed unreal, almost like a dream. I spent the next few days at home, regaining my strength. The doctor recommended that I rest, avoid stress, and get plenty of sleep. I followed his advice, trying not to think about the strange device found in the attic. My body gradually recovered, and my mind became clearer. A few days later, I decided to return to my normal life. Morning lectures and work on architectural projects resumed. I returned to my usual schedule: classes, the library, meeting with friends. Everything seemed normal, but something inside me had changed. One morning I was on the bus heading to my classes. I sat by the window, trying to ignore the crowd of passengers around me. The weather was gloomy, the city shrouded in gray mist, and a light chill hung in the air. The bus moved slowly due to traffic, and as usual I stared out the window, lost in thought. Suddenly I noticed something strange on the sidewalk. At first I thought it was a person in a costume, perhaps a street performer or part of a promotional event. But the longer I looked, the more eerie the sight became. The figure was large, much taller than an average person, and covered in thick black hair. Its arms were longer than usual, with sharp claws, and its face resembled a wolf's, with glowing yellow eyes and a sinister grin that revealed sharp teeth. The creature stood still, staring straight at me, as if piercing into the depths of my soul. At first I thought it was some kind of joke, perhaps part of a Halloween celebration, despite the fact that the holiday was still a few weeks away. But something about this creature filled me with a chill of fear that ran down my spine. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else noticed this monster. The passengers on the bus appeared completely calm, talking, reading books, or looking at their phones, paying no attention to what was happening outside. It seemed that no one but me could see this eerie creature. The bus continued moving, and we started to pass by the creature. It still stared at me with its evil eyes, and I couldn't look away. At that moment, I realized this wasn't a person in a costume, but a real monster, perhaps a werewolf. This realization filled me with icy terror. I had never encountered anything like this in real life. As we finally drove past, I tried to compose myself. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down, but my heart was still racing. I tried to find a logical explanation for what I had seen, but nothing came to mind. This couldn't be a figment of my imagination. Everything was too real. I couldn't stop thinking about it all the way to the university. My thoughts were torn between fear and curiosity. I realized that the world I lived in held more than I could have ever imagined. After that incident on the bus, the sight I saw wouldn't leave my mind. The image of the hairy creature with glowing yellow eyes and sharp teeth kept resurfacing in my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety and fear. Every time I went outside or rode public transportation, I unconsciously looked for that monster, hoping never to see it again. A week passed, but I couldn't return to my usual life. Everything around me seemed different, as if another reality full of mysteries and dangers lay behind the familiar world. Even my friends and classes at the university couldn't distract me from thoughts about that creature. One evening I was walking home after classes. The street was quiet and cool, and the city was gradually sinking into evening silence. I was trudging along the sidewalk, lost in my thoughts, when I suddenly felt that same chill of fear I had felt on the bus. I stopped and looked around, my heart beating faster. A few meters away, standing under a dim streetlight, I saw that same creature. It was him, the same hairy wolfman I had seen from the bus window. His figure looked even more sinister in the light of the street lamp, casting long shadows. The creature walked down the sidewalk, its movements smooth and confident like a predator, and it was approaching me. Its claws glistened in the light, and the sinister grin revealed a row of sharp yellow teeth. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. My body was paralyzed with fear, but my mind tried to find some logical explanation for what was happening. I looked around again, hoping someone else would notice this creature. But people around were going about their business, paying no attention to it. No one but me saw this terrifying monster. As the creature came closer, I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead. My thoughts were in complete chaos. What was this creature? Why could only I see it? What did it want from me? But to my surprise, the monster just walked past me, not paying any attention to me. It continued down the sidewalk as if I didn't exist. I stood in place, unable to move, until the creature disappeared from sight. My legs were shaking, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was a real creature, not a figment of my imagination, and it just walked past, not noticing me. As I stood there, shocked and paralyzed with fear, I suddenly felt someone approach me from behind. I felt hot breath on my ear and caught the pleasant scent of perfume. "You can see them, can't you?" a strange voice whispered. I turned sharply and saw a girl standing very close. She was stunningly beautiful, with a determined and resolute expression. Her outfit immediately caught my attention. She was dressed extravagantly, in a leather jacket and camo pants. She wore high boots, and her waist was adorned with a belt with various pockets and accessories. Her figure suggested she was an athlete, slim, with developed muscles, yet feminine and graceful. The girl looked at me with interest and a slight smile. "Follow me," she said, not waiting for my response. Surprisingly, I obeyed, as if my mind couldn't resist her confidence. We walked through the city streets, and I tried to keep up with her brisk pace. Passers-by turned to look at us. I continued to follow her, trying to process what was happening and remember everything that had occurred in the past few minutes. After some time, we approached an old but impressive building. It was 5 stories high, with tall windows and massive stone walls. The building looked abandoned, but still retained its former grandeur. At the entrance were large wooden doors with rusty metal inserts. Above the doors hung an old sign, barely legible: Armitage Library. The girl stopped in front of the doors and turned to me. "This place is safe. We can talk here," she said, opening the door and inviting me in. Inside, the building was much cozier than I expected. We found ourselves in a spacious hall with high ceilings adorned with stucco. Old bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient tomes and manuscripts. In the center of the hall were several antique chairs and tables, scattered with books and papers. Everything around us breathed history and knowledge. The girl gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs and took a seat opposite me. "My name is Alice," she introduced herself, looking at me intently as if not believing her own words. I introduced myself in return. Then, as if unsure, she said, "You really see those creatures on the street? I saw your face and understood everything." "Yes, that's right," I replied, still feeling a slight tremble in my voice. "I saw that creature on the bus a week ago and today on the street. It looked like something out of a nightmare." Alice leaned forward, her face becoming serious. "Max, do you understand what this means? The fact that you can see them is an incredibly rare ability. We hunters train for years to learn to recognize their signs, but you can see them exactly as they are." "Hunters?" I asked. "You hunt them?" "Yes," she nodded. "I work for an organization that identifies and eliminates these creatures. They live among people, hiding under normal appearances, and pose a huge threat. Our biggest problem is identifying them, recognizing who they really are. Your ability is something incredible." I felt chills run down my spine. "But why me? Why can I see them?" Alice sighed and leaned back in her chair. "That's what we need to find out." She then got up and walked to an old cabinet against the wall. She opened it and took out a thick folder labeled Classified. Sitting back in her chair, she placed the folder on the table and began to explain. "These creatures appeared hundreds of years ago," she began. "The history of their origin is shrouded in mystery. But one thing is certain. They live among us, hiding under the guise of ordinary people. Their true forms are the stuff of nightmares, monsters from ancient legends. They hunt us, humans, and many missing persons are their victims. She opened the folder and began flipping through pages full of photographs, reports, and newspaper clippings. "Here's a case from 1987, she said, showing me one of the pages. In the small town of Woodbury, Minnesota, an entire family disappeared. Parents, John and Margaret Rivers, and their children, Sarah and Thomas. One night they just vanished. The police found no signs of a struggle or any clues. But our organization, after examining the place, found evidence of these creatures' presence. Strange tracks and remnants of their energy. Later, in a nearby forest, we discovered their lair filled with remains." Alice turned the page and showed me another story. "And here's a case from 2003 New York. A young woman named Linda Hopkins disappeared on her way home from work. The police closed the case, deciding she had simply run away. But we found her traces in an old abandoned building on the corner. There was a lot of blood, and we realized she had fallen victim to one of these monsters. Unfortunately, we couldn't find her body, but we know she was killed." I listened to her with horror and fascination, realizing how serious the threat from these creatures was. "But how do they choose their victims? Why do they hunt people?" I asked, trying to understand their motives. Alice sighed. "They feed on our energy, our fear and pain. Some of them simply enjoy hunting and killing, while others use our bodies and souls for their dark rituals and purposes. These are ancient beings, and their motives aren't always clear. But one thing is certain. They are dangerous, and we must stop them." She closed the folder and looked at me with determination. "That's why your ability is so important, Max. You can see them, and that gives us a huge advantage. With your help, we can find and eliminate them faster, saving lives." I listened to her, and at some point, fear and doubt took over, and I decided I needed to leave. I stood up, feeling panic rising in my chest. Alice, noticing my movements, tried to stop me. "Max, wait!" she exclaimed, reaching out to grab my shoulder. "You can't just leave. We need your help." But I was already heading for the exit. "Sorry, Alice. This is too much for me. I'm not sure I can handle it." I ran out of the library without looking back. Her words still echoed in my head, but I couldn't stop. Shock and disbelief overwhelmed me, and I just wanted to get away from it all. I ran several blocks before stopping, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had happened. It all felt like a nightmare I wanted to wake up from. The next morning, still feeling the after effects of the shock and disbelief, I left my house to go to the university. But after taking a few steps, I noticed something strange. 3 men were standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, clearly watching me. They looked stern and imposing. The first was tall and muscular, with short blonde hair and cold blue eyes. He wore a black leather jacket and military boots. The second was shorter, but no less intimidating, with a dark beard and a grim expression. He was dressed in a camouflage jacket and jeans. The third was middle-aged, with long black hair tied back in a ponytail, and looked more intellectual with glasses and a leather jacket. But the most surprising thing was that Alice was with them. I turned to go the other way, but she noticed me and immediately headed toward me. Her face showed a mix of concern and determination. "Max, wait!" she called out, approaching. "You can't just walk away. This is too important." I stopped, feeling a new wave of fear and distrust rising inside me. These people, Alice. They all looked like they had come here specifically for me. "What's going on here? Who are these people? I asked, trying not to show my anxiety. These are my colleagues, she replied, stopping next to me. We're all part of the organization I told you about. Max, I understand this is all too much for you, but we really need your help. You have a unique ability, and without you, we can't effectively fight these creatures. Alice moved closer to me, her gaze full of understanding and compassion. Max, I understand that you're scared, she said softly. I'm not asking you to risk your life. All I need is for you to hear me out. Can you just give me a chance to explain everything? I hesitated, feeling fear and doubt battling inside me. But her sincerity and persistence made me think. Finally, I nodded. Okay, I agreed. I'll listen to you. Alice smiled with relief. Thank you, Max. Let's go. We have a place where we can talk more calmly. We all headed to a nearby parked car. It was a large, dark-colored SUV that looked quite imposing. Alice and the three men got inside, and I followed them, feeling a bit anxious. The car started moving, and we drove out of the city. I tried not to show my fear, but thoughts swirled in my head about where they were taking me and what awaited me. We drove for about half an hour until we reached a narrow road leading through a dense forest. Suddenly, a high fence topped with barbed wire appeared before us. The gates opened, and we drove onto the grounds of an abandoned factory. The vehicle passed through a wide courtyard filled with remnants of old equipment and overgrown with tall grass, and stopped in front of a massive hangar. We got out of the car, and Alice gestured for me to follow her. The hangar was huge, its metal walls towering above us, and the gates were wide enough to let a truck through. We entered, and I was stunned by what I saw. Inside, the hangar had been converted into a fully operational base. This place was clearly in use and well maintained. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, filled with crates, containers, and equipment. In the center of the space was a command post with a large table covered in maps and documents. Several computers and monitors displayed various data and video feeds. In one corner of the hangar was a training area with targets, mannequins, and other sporting equipment. In another corner was a laboratory with analysis and research equipment. People in tactical clothing bustled about, busy with their tasks. Alice led me to the command post and offered me a seat. This is our base, Max. Here we coordinate our actions, train, and study everything related to these creatures. She pointed to one of the men who had followed us. This is Jack, our tactical operations specialist. Jack, tall and muscular, nodded at me in greeting. And this is Mark, our analyst, she continued, pointing to the man with the dark beard. And finally, this is Sam, our medical expert, Alice concluded, indicating the man in glasses. I looked around, still trying to process everything that was happening. Why did you bring me here? I asked, feeling my anxiety gradually turning into interest. Alice looked at me. Max, you don't need to fight. Your job will be to identify the targets. Leave the rest to us. One of the guys, Mark, looked at me and said, But first, we need to test your ability. I thought that if all I needed to do was identify the targets, it was quite acceptable. I nodded in agreement. How did you get this ability? Alice asked, her voice calm but curious. I told her about the device I found in Professor Harrison's house and that it was still there. She nodded, contemplating what I had said. We'll need to examine that device later, she said. It might be the key to understanding your ability. Then they gave me a bulletproof vest, which I put on under my clothes. It was lightweight, but still added a sense of security. They also gave me an earpiece and a small transmitter, communication tools so I could stay in contact with the team. After that, we all got back into the SUV and headed to the city. I sat in the back seat, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Soon we found ourselves on one of the main streets, filled with people going about their business. The evening sun was setting, casting golden hues over the city. We drove slowly down the street, and I looked out the windows trying to spot a target. The people around looked ordinary, and nothing seemed suspicious. Hours passed, but I still couldn't find any signs of the creatures. Skepticism in the eyes of Mark and Jack was becoming more apparent. They exchanged glances, clearly doubting my abilities. But just as it started to get dark, I suddenly saw it. The creature was standing by a lamppost as if waiting for someone. It looked exactly the same as before. Tall, hairy, with glowing yellow eyes and a sinister grin. My heart began to race, but I tried to stay calm. "There," I whispered, pointing toward the creature. "I see it." The team sprang into action immediately. Alice gave orders and we got out of the car, trying not to attract attention. The creature started moving and we followed, trying not to lose sight of it. It walked quickly but confidently, and it seemed that no one around noticed its true nature. We pursued it through several blocks until it turned into a narrow alley. I felt the tension rising. Alice and the guys walked beside me, their faces focused and determined. "Max, stay back," Alice said firmly. "You've done your part. Now it's our turn." I nodded, staying a bit behind so as not to interfere. The creature picked up speed, realizing it was being followed, but the team was ready. They efficiently surrounded the alley, spreading out on both sides. Jack and Mark took positions ahead. Sam stayed slightly behind, covering the rear, and Alice directed the operation from the center. I stayed close to her, trying not to get in the way and observing what was happening. The creature began to realize it had been tracked. It growled, and its eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting the streetlights. The hair on its body stood on end, and its claws began to dig into the asphalt, preparing for an attack. The team was armed with special tools and weapons designed to fight these creatures. Jack had a large caliber rifle with silver bullets intended for maximum damage to the target. Mark carried a backpack with various traps and devices, including a net with electric charges and grenades with flash and noise effects. Sam, besides his medical kit, had a crossbow with special bolts dipped in a paralyzing substance. The creature lunged at us, moving swiftly. Jack opened fire, his rifle emitting quiet but powerful shots. The silver bullets embedded into the creature's body, making it roar in pain. But it didn't stop it completely. Mark threw the electric net forward. It unfolded in the air and landed on the creature, closing the circuit and paralyzing it for a few seconds. The creature thrashed in agony, trying to free itself from the net, but the electric charges held it. "Go, Sam!" Alice shouted. Sam fired his crossbow, and the bolt hit the creature right in the chest. The paralyzing substance began to work instantly, slowing the monster's movements and sapping its strength. The creature roared even louder, its eyes darting around, finally realizing it couldn't escape. Alice approached, her face showing determination and focus. She raised her gun and aimed at the creature's head. Several shots followed, each precise and lethal. The creature collapsed to the ground, its body twitching for a few moments before becoming still. We all stood there, breathing heavily, realizing the battle was over. The team quickly began to gather and remove evidence. Jack, lifting the electric net, cast a quick glance at us and said, "We need to move fast before the cops arrive." Alice nodded and immediately started coordinating actions. Mark and Sam collected the fragments of the crossbow bolts and other used tools. Jack gathered the bullet casings and other traces that could indicate our presence. Then they approached the creature's body. They took a special large bag made of durable material from the car, and carefully placed the werewolf's body inside. The streets around us were still empty, and no one seemed to have noticed our operation. Nevertheless, we acted with utmost caution. Within a few minutes, all evidence was collected and destroyed, and we returned to the SUV. Once inside the car, everyone let out a relieved sigh. Alice turned to me, her face beaming with a smile. "Max, you did great," she said, patting me on the shoulder. "Without you, we wouldn't have found that creature so quickly." Jack, sitting at the wheel, glanced back and added, "We used to spend months tracking them down. With your help, we can do it much faster." Mark and Sam also expressed their approval, welcoming me to the team. I felt a surge of pride and satisfaction inside me. It was recognition that I could truly help and be useful in this dangerous mission. "But we have one more important task," Alice said, turning serious again. "We need to go to Professor Harrison and find out more about that device." We all nodded in agreement. Jack started the car and we set off. The road seemed long. When we finally arrived, it was quite late. We got out of the car, and I suggested that Alice and the others wait outside. "Maybe I should talk to him first? The professor doesn't know about werewolves and all the rest. We need to prepare him," I said, looking at Alice. She nodded in agreement. "Okay, we'll wait here. Let us know if you need our help." I walked to the front door and knocked. After a few moments, the professor opened the door. "Max, what brings you here at this late hour?" he asked, his face showing concern. "Professor, this is very important," I began. "I need to talk to you alone." He gestured for me to come in, and we walked into the living room. I sat down in a soft chair, and the professor settled opposite me. "Max, what happened?" he asked, noticing my anxious state. "Professor, do you remember that device I found at your place?" I began, trying to find the right words. "It activated in me the ability to see something strange. Creatures that live among us but hide under human guises." The professor looked puzzled. "Max, what are you talking about? What creatures?" I sighed and continued. "I know this sounds incredible, but hear me out. These creatures are werewolves. They hunt people, and many of the missing persons are their victims. I didn't know how to explain it before, but now I've met people who also know about this. They are helping me understand and fight them." I went into more detail about all the events. The professor looked stunned, but listened attentively. "Max, this is incredible, but what do you want from me?" "The device, Professor. We need to study it to understand how it gave me this ability." The professor sighed wearily. "Someone broke into my house last night and stole the device. I tried to investigate, but there were hardly any clues left." I felt a surge of anxiety inside me. Who could have done this? Why do they need the device? The professor shook his head. "I don't know." I was shocked by what I heard, but I gathered my thoughts and thanked the professor for his help. We exchanged a few more words, and I headed for the exit. As I reached the door, I turned and said, "Thank you, Professor. We'll keep you informed." He nodded, and I left the house, returning to the car where Alice and the team were waiting. They all looked tense and worried. "What did he say?" Alice asked as I approached. "The device was stolen," I replied. "The professor said someone broke into his house last night and took it. He has no idea who it could have been." The team looked worried. Jack, Mark, and Sam exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of the situation. Alice frowned, her expression becoming more determined. "This is bad news," she said. "But we can't stop now. We need to find out who did this and why. Max, you did great. Now we'll take you home. You deserve some rest." We all got back into the car, and Jack started the engine. On the way home, I sat in silence, processing everything that had happened that evening. My mind was filled with thoughts of mysterious creatures, the device, and our new mission. But despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt that I was now on the right path. When we arrived at my house, Alice turned to me. "Max, we'll be in touch. If you need anything, call us immediately," she said, smiling. "Thank you all," I replied, getting out of the car. "I appreciate your help and support." We said our goodbyes, and I headed to my house, watching as the car drove away. Inside, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I lay down in bed, hoping for a short rest before the new challenges ahead. Images of werewolves and the stolen device still swirled in my mind, but fatigue took over, and I quickly fell asleep. Waking up to a strange noise, I immediately felt a sense of growing anxiety. The noise was quiet but continuous, like many footsteps behind the walls of the house. I listened, trying to understand what was happening, but each second made it feel more eerie. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Getting out of bed, I slowly walked through the house, trying not to make any noise. In the living room, I glanced out the window and was horrified. Outside, surrounding my house, stood the very creatures, werewolves. There were hundreds of them, filling the entire yard. The moonlight reflected in their yellow eyes, and I realized they had come for me. I quickly grabbed my phone and started calling Alice. There was no answer, but I kept trying, knowing that my time was running out. Suddenly, I heard something scratching at the walls and door. The creatures had started to break into the house. Panic began to take hold of me, but trying to keep calm, I realized that the only way out was to run. Grabbing the nearest jacket and keys, I rushed to the back door. At the moment I opened it, several werewolves had already started breaking down the front door. I ran out into the backyard and dashed into the darkness of the night. My neighborhood was sparsely populated, and the streets seemed deserted and grim. Only a few streetlights illuminated the way. I ran as fast as I could, feeling the cold night air burning my lungs. The werewolves were on my tail, their menacing growls and the sound of their footsteps echoing behind me. I turned a corner, trying to find shelter or a safe place, but with each moment looking back, I saw that the creatures were not falling behind. There were too many of them, and they weren't going to stop. I picked up the pace, overcoming fatigue and fear, trying to find a path to safety. My mind was filled with thoughts of how to warn Alice and the others. I needed to find a safe place where I could hide and wait for help. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was Alice. "Max, what's happening? You called?" Her voice sounded worried. "They're here, Alice. They've surrounded my house. There are hundreds of them and they're chasing me," I shouted, continuing to run. "Hang in there, we're coming to you. Find shelter, we'll be there soon," she replied, and the line went dead. Running through the deserted streets of my neighborhood, I tried to find a safe place to hide from the creatures chasing me. Seeing dense bushes ahead, I decided to cut through them, hoping it would help me shake off the pursuit. But suddenly, as soon as I entered the thick vegetation, I felt a strong blow to my head and lost consciousness. When I woke up, there was silence, broken only by the dull sounds of footsteps and quiet growling. I found myself in a large hall, dimly lit by torches. The walls were rough stone, covered in ancient symbols. I was surrounded by the same creatures I had seen earlier, their eyes glowing in the dim light, reflecting hatred and anger. In the center of the hall, on a massive throne, sat a huge creature, significantly larger and more imposing than the others. Its fur was black, its eyes burned bright yellow, and its claws glistened in the torchlight. In its paws, I noticed the familiar device, the one I had found at Professor Harrison's. "You've awakened," the creature said in a low, menacing voice. "You must explain how you could see us." I tried to sit up and looked around, feeling paralyzed by fear. I don't know," I stammered. "I just found this device, and since then I've been able to see you." The creature stared at me, its eyes boring into me. "You're lying," it growled. "We knew immediately that you could see us. We've been watching you ever since you first noticed one of us. You stared at us too long, and that gave you away." I shook my head, trying to gather my thoughts. "I'm telling the truth. I don't know how the device works. I found it by accident and don't understand why I can see you now." The creature growled, its claws gripping the armrests of the throne. "You must find out the truth, or you won't leave here alive." I tried to process its words, but my head was still spinning from the blow. "I really don't know how it works. I tried to understand it, but I couldn't. Maybe Professor Harrison knows more." The creature leaned forward, its eyes flashing. "Your professor, he's just a man. We must learn the truth, and you will help us do that. Otherwise you'll die here, like all who dared to stand in our way." My head spun from fear and confusion. I knew I had to buy time until Alice and the team could find me. "If you let me go, I'll try to find out more. I'll contact the professor and try to figure out how the device works." The creature leaned forward, its eyes flashing with anger. "You dare to bargain with us? We'll kill you if we don't get answers." Suddenly, the hall's silence was shattered by the deafening sound of gunfire. A firefight erupted from all corners of the hall, filling the air with screams and sounds of combat. I dropped to the floor, trying to find cover. At that moment, I realized that help had arrived. The hunters had stormed the hall. Alice and her team acted quickly and professionally. Jack, Mark, and Sam opened fire, shooting at the werewolves with silver bullets and skillfully moving between cover. The hall turned into chaos. The creatures roared and lunged into battle, defending and counterattacking. Jack, armed with a rifle, targeted the largest werewolves, his bullets tearing through their bodies, making them retreat and roar in pain. Mark, with a backpack full of traps, threw flash grenades at the enemies, blinding them and giving the team a chance to make accurate shots. Sam, using his crossbow, sent bolts with incredible precision into the hearts of the monsters, paralyzing them and taking them out of the fight. Alice was at the center of the action. She confidently gave orders, holding a silenced pistol and shooting accurately at those who tried to get close to us. Her actions were precise and decisive, leaving the enemies no chance. I tried to hide behind one of the large columns, avoiding the crossfire. My heart pounded with adrenaline and fear, but I knew I had to hold on until the fight was over. Several werewolves rushed toward me, but were immediately met with fire from the hunters. Jack and Sam covered me, preventing the enemies from getting close. I watched as one werewolf, hit by a bolt in the chest, collapsed to the floor, while another, under Jack's precise fire, retreated with a loud growl. The battle continued, filling the hall with smoke and deafening sounds. The werewolves attacked with doubled fury, but the hunters acted cohesively and organized, holding their ground. I saw Alice leap towards a werewolf and shoot it in the head at close range, making the monster fall dead. But the most terrifying was the monster on the throne. It watched the battle, holding the device, and its eyes burned with rage. It roared, attracting the attention of its subordinates, and charged into the fight, swinging its massive clawed paws. The huge creature was incredibly strong and fast. It lunged at Jack, throwing him aside. Jack managed to fire a few shots, but the bullets only slightly slowed the monster. The creature grabbed him by the shoulder and hurled him against the wall, then turned to Alice. Alice, not wasting a second, threw a flash grenade at it. The explosion blinded the monster, and Alice seized the moment to shoot it in the chest. But this only enraged the creature further. It roared and began moving toward her, its claws gleaming in the torchlight. Mark and Sam rushed to help, throwing nets with electric charges at the monster. The huge creature writhed in agony but managed to tear the nets apart and continued its path toward Alice. At that moment, I realized I had to do something. Grabbing a piece of debris, I rushed to the throne where the device still lay. I grabbed it and tried to understand how it worked. Suddenly, the creature noticed me and charged at me, its eyes burning with rage. "Give it back!" it roared, raising its claw for a strike. But at that moment, Jack, having recovered from the blow, charged at the creature from behind, distracting its attention. He plunged a knife into its back, making the monster roar in pain. Alice, Mark, and Sam immediately seized the moment and opened fire on the creature. The monster, weakened by numerous wounds, growled and retreated, slipping out of the hall through one of the dark passages. Its eyes flashed one last time before it disappeared into the darkness, leaving us in a wrecked hall filled with bodies and destruction. I stood in shock and exhaustion, surrounded by the bodies of dead monsters. The team also looked worn out. Alice approached me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Max, are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I nodded, though my heart was still racing from the ordeal. "Yes, I'm fine," I replied, trying to smile. Suddenly, I felt the device in my hands start to heat up. It became increasingly hot, and in a panic, I dropped it to the floor. The device hit the ground, and at that moment, a bright flash of light burst from it. A three-dimensional projection appeared before us, displaying a map of the Earth. Red dots began to appear on the map, spreading like something sinister, covering the entire surface like a plague. We stood in shock, not understanding what was happening. The projection zoomed in, and where the red dots were, millions of werewolves began to appear. They filled the map like a giant army ready for invasion. We watched in horror and confusion, trying to comprehend what this meant. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Suddenly we heard a terrifying roar emanating from the projection. The sound was so powerful and eerie that it made us all step back several paces. The projection flickered and went out, leaving us in complete darkness. "What was that?" Sam asked, looking around. Alice picked up the device and carefully examined it. "It looks like it was a signal. Maybe a warning or something else." I collapsed to the floor in exhaustion. Damn. What else do we have to face? I just want to go home and rest properly. But it seemed that wouldn't happen anytime soon, as we heard numerous roars coming from the corridor. Reinforcements for the creatures had arrived.
Story 2.
Trying to hold back my tears so the hungry werewolf prowling nearby wouldn't hear, I hid under the roots of a large oak tree, clutching my head in my hands and pressing my knees to my chin. Fear and anxiety gripped my stomach, and the strange sensations in my lower abdomen made me want to throw up to get rid of them. My whole body trembled from the cold night and fear. I was about to become dinner for a predator. The heavy snowfall was also making itself felt. If I stayed under these roots any longer, I'd become a small snowdrift. I didn't even know what would be worse, being eaten or freezing to death. How could my father leave me in this frosty Alaskan forest? Maybe it was my fault. I got distracted by a little deer and decided to admire it, not noticing how slowly I walked toward it. And Dad didn't notice this because he was always ahead, talking to me, but I rarely responded, as I often got lost in my thoughts. He was used to it and even liked having such a monologue with himself. I think if he did notice my disappearance, it was several miles later. Who knows how far I walked after that fawn? I'm the only one to blame for this situation. If I had kept the conversation going with Dad, everything would have been different. I wouldn't be sitting hungry and freezing under these roots, fearing for my life right now. The first 2 hours after realizing I was lost, I stood still, hoping Dad would find me. As in my childish mind, he was a super tracker and hunter who could easily find a lost child and take down a bear with his bare hands. Though he really was that way, minus the exaggerations. He couldn't find me in those hours. So after those 2 hours, I decided to act on my own. The sunset was approaching, and that was very bad for me. I'd say horrible. Gathering my thoughts and recalling what my father had taught me, I followed my own tracks. Snow was falling, but very lightly, so it hadn't completely covered my tracks. Luckily, there was no wind. I don't know how far I walked, but after some time I reached a dead end. There were no tracks, as if no one had walked there. I was surprised and felt uneasy. They couldn't just disappear like that. Why were the last tracks visible, then suddenly just clean snow? It was already getting dark and I needed to act. But what could I do? My body was already weak, and my stomach wouldn't stop demanding food. But I had nothing to give it. Dad carried all the supplies and tools. I could only hope that the night would be clear and full of moonlight, so there would be some illumination, or I wouldn't survive in this stupid Alaskan forest. I continued wandering through the forest, hoping to see the light of a lantern in the distance. Fatigue kept growing and growing. I just wanted to lie down in this pure white snow and sleep. But I wouldn't wake up if I did that. Even if I was lucky enough not to freeze to death, wild animals might not be as lucky. I could already hear the werewolf's howl, but I leaned more towards thinking it was just the wind or some other animal, maybe even a bird. My fingers were already numb from the cold, and my toes were beginning to freeze. My eyelashes were covered with a thin layer of snow and ice particles. My long hair had slipped out of my hat and fallen onto my face. I could feel how icy they were, noticing occasionally when they fell over my eyes, turning pure white. My cheeks burned from the cold. They were probably already rosy, and I looked like a snowman who couldn't handle this doggone cold. Luckily, I had dressed warmer than usual, or I'd already be an icicle. The sun had already set behind the horizon, giving way to the moon, which didn't bring me any joy. It was dark enough that I had to strain my eyes to see what was happening a few feet away. Once again, I heard a howl, but this time accompanied by quick footsteps. This frightened and tensed me greatly. Thoughts crossed my mind. What if the werewolf is stalking me and waiting for the right moment? Now he's the hunter, and I'm the small prey, and he's playing with me, giving me a ghostly chance to escape. But he knows that no matter where I go, it will be pointless. He'll find me anywhere. I had to move as slowly and carefully as possible, straining to see in the darkness and listen intently. But I wanted to speed up, even run, but nothing good would come of it. My strength would leave me quickly, and I'd become an easy target for wild animals, especially for my gray neighbor. My body would sweat, which meant I'd freeze faster and die. Walking slowly wasn't a good idea either for the same reason, the cold. But it was better than running blindly into the dark, where the unknown awaited. I didn't know how much time had passed, but my legs were already refusing to move. I constantly stumbled and fell face first into the snowdrifts. My face burned and stung. One time, I didn't want to get up and fight anymore, just give up. Only thoughts of my parents gave me the strength to get up and walk through the pain. It was excruciating to imagine my mother crying while my father tried to comfort her, promising to find me. I was sure he had already gathered a group of people to search for me, and only that thought kept me warm. It gave me hope of surviving in this cold January forest. To avoid falling asleep, I talked to myself a lot and thought about many things. Sometimes I had to slap myself to stay awake, or I'd collapse and never wake up. I wondered if an ordinary child could survive in such conditions. A typical child who enjoyed toys, played with friends, and did whatever they wanted. The kind of child who never went hunting alone in the forest and wasn't trained in this craft all their childhood. I'm sure they couldn't. First they would cry, then fall on the frozen ground, and the last thing awaiting them would be an ordinary death from the cold. This amused me a little. I was better than them and could survive in such conditions, or at least try to do something about it rather than give up without a fight. On the other hand, it saddened me. I wanted to be like all the other kids, not a young hunter. Looking at the starry sky, I felt sick. Huge clouds were approaching. In a few minutes, I would be without moonlight, alone with the grim forest and the inevitable threat. Suddenly, a terrifying and piercing werewolf howl echoed through the forest. At that moment, I was genuinely terrified to the point of madness. Panic overwhelmed me. My eyes darted around the forest, trying to find something or someone. My legs buckled. It became even harder to stand. A nervous chuckle escaped my lips. It seemed I was having the luck of a drowning man tonight. Soon my fate would be decided, either a painful death, or I'd manage to get far enough away from the werewolf and find help. With all my heart, I hoped for the latter. But I understood that the former was more likely. And then it happened. Dark clouds completely obscured the moon and brought one of the strongest snowfalls I'd ever seen in my short life. The cursed wind blew so hard that my face ended up in a snowdrift again. My poor legs struggled to keep balance, but they tried their best. But my eyes suffered the most. Now I couldn't see anything beyond an arm's length. Everything around took on a dark blue color. Maybe it seemed that way, or maybe it was a problem with my vision. I couldn't tell. Now the snow underfoot was dark blue with a slight tint of white. Each further step was taken with great fear and pain in my legs. My head was filled with thoughts of a warm home and a soft bed, my mother's gentle hands, and my father's kind eyes. Each time I replayed these thoughts in my head, I wanted to cry and stop, to rest, but I couldn't. Any stop or tear would kill me. If I did that, I would weaken and not be as strong as I was now. My body would just stop obeying me, so I had to keep going. I had to get home to my parents, and I just had to survive in this frozen forest. The occasional hoots of owls and all sorts of incomprehensible rustles scared me to the point of heartache. All these sounds made me stop and look around. Each time, my knees shook more and more, even though I understood it was just harmless birds or the cracking of branches from the wind. It seemed that if I stayed here a little longer, I'd fall from the cold. My young body couldn't endure such trials much longer. Even now, I was amazed I had lasted so long in this dreadful cold. And once again, the gray werewolf made his presence known, now growling nearby, seemingly just a few yards from me, but darkness and the blizzard concealed him. My breathing was completely off. My heart pounded wildly, but it was just an illusion. I had to stop to listen and understand where he was and try to calm down. I strained my hearing as much as I could in my pitiful state. Silence. I couldn't hear anything except the crunch of trees. The wind drowned out everything, worsening the situation. But I still stood and listened, hoping I could detect him. I'd like to believe he left, but that's unlikely. He's been watching me from the start, waiting for the right moment when my body and mind give up. He wants to feel like a true hunter who doesn't kill his prey immediately but waits for the right moment. I'm sure the werewolf understood he could have easily dealt with me at the beginning, but he didn't, meaning he clearly enjoys watching me suffer. Perhaps several minutes passed as I listened intently to my surroundings to determine where he was hiding. Absolute silence. Most likely he realized I was trying to figure out how close he had gotten. Another couple of minutes passed, and then I heard him. It would have been better if I hadn't, because his heavy breathing sounded behind me. Everything froze inside me. Oxygen refused to enter my lungs. I started to suffocate. My face turned blue. Warm sweat trickled down my frozen forehead. I didn't want to believe what was happening. He was standing right behind me, watching me. With difficulty, I managed to catch my breath so my lungs started working again, but it was such a hellish struggle. The first breath was painful, I don't know why. I had only two options: run forward and not look back, or slowly turn around to check if he was really there. There was no time for deliberation. I had to act. Common sense suggested, even screamed, to run. But how far could I run? Curiosity, on the other hand, told me to look over my shoulder. After a few seconds of deliberation, I decided to turn. Curiosity won that battle. Very slowly and with great fear, I turned my head over my shoulder. My heart was about to burst out of my chest, and my eyes were ready to pop out of their sockets. I was trembling all over. It seemed like time had stopped or slowed down significantly. Snow fell slowly to the ground as if it didn't want to. I was sure it was all in my imagination, though I believed it was really happening. Adrenaline was at work, making everything seem slow in my eyes so I could react to danger. And then my head reached the point of no return. There was no turning back. I squinted to see everything in the darkness. I wanted to close my eyes, but then I wouldn't be able to face my fear. At first, I saw no one, only the void between the trees. But as soon as I stared into that void, I noticed his muzzle. Yellow eyes glowed in the dark, looking hungry, angry, and cunning. His jaws were open so wide that drool flowed abundantly onto the snow. So much steam came out of his mouth that it seemed like a mini-train, not a werewolf, was in front of me. It looked as if he was smiling at me. Maybe it wasn't like that, and my child's imagination made it up and presented it as reality. My gaze remained fixed on him, and my head was filled with thoughts of what to do next. Nothing useful came to mind. My brain seemed to die at that moment, leaving only instincts and feelings. I quickly turned away from him and looked ahead. My body was paralyzed. It stopped feeling the cold and stopped obeying my commands. At that moment, I felt absolutely nothing but the fear that settled in my body and tightened my muscles. It seemed I was standing in complete silence, not even hearing the wind. A menacing growl came from behind me, breaking the mysterious silence. It was like waking up from a dream, and now my eardrums were filled with the whistling wind again. My pupils dilated and my breathing quickened many times over. A moment later, I was running, not even remembering how I started running. It was like I was in a trance, waking up just now. My last strength was leaving me. I didn't know if he was chasing me, but I kept running as I had never run before in my short life. I didn't even suspect I could run so fast. My breathing quickly became erratic, but I tried to keep it steady, as my father had taught me. Breathe evenly and rhythmically. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. It sounds pretty simple, but when a werewolf is chasing you, and your life depends on how well you run. Such a thought flashed through my mind, but it wasn't time for that thought. In this hellish situation, I also had to watch my steps to avoid falling, and that was my downfall. I crashed into a tree with all my might. The pain was so unbearable that I involuntarily screamed throughout the forest. The forest inhabitants reacted to my scream. The sound of birds taking off around me reached my ears. The flapping of wings was so loud and clear that it seemed like an incredibly large flock of birds took off near me and now circled above my head. Due to the dark night, I couldn't see them. It felt like they were now watching me. Maybe they were signaling the werewolf that I had stopped here, doing it for the bloody spectacle where the gray werewolf would tear me to pieces. Maybe they wanted to feast on me too, for example on my eyes or drink my fresh and warm blood. No, probably not. This is all my wild imagination. Just a coincidence that they circled right above me. The monstrous pain brought me back to reality. The pain in my forehead was especially sharp. It seemed I had broken it. Touching my forehead with my hand, I felt warm blood. My whole body began to tremble. A sharp pain pierced my head, and my stomach started to churn. I felt terribly sick. Blood trickled down my forehead, mixing with tears of despair. At that moment, I fully realized my situation and the hopelessness. I was just a child, lost in the night forest, and there was nothing I could do to survive. My body ached with pain and exhaustion, and my stomach twisted with hunger. Falling to my knees, I cried out to the sky, "Why? Why did you follow that stupid deer? What was the point? Why didn't you just keep going with Dad? Now you're suffering because of your stupid mistake. Now you'll perish in this forest." At that moment, I lost control. With my last strength, I pounded the ground, pouring out my anger on myself. "Mom, Dad, I want to go home. I want to see you again. Please take me away from here." I moaned and didn't realize I was already lying on the ground, face down in the snow. I couldn't lie down. I had to try to stand up and keep fighting, even though I no longer believed in my strength. With great effort, I managed to stand up. Standing was extremely difficult. I swayed from side to side. The fear of taking a step overwhelmed me, knowing I could easily fall and never get up again. Taking small steps, I moved forward, not knowing where, not knowing what awaited me or what would happen to me. But I continued my journey. The rustling behind me returned, just like the birds circling above me. There was no doubt he had returned to me if he ever left at all. Now he decided to remind me of his presence again. My body knew it couldn't run again, and apparently the predator knew it too. Realizing these were likely my last steps, I resigned myself to death and just kept walking. The only thing that scared me was not knowing when he would attack. That's what was truly frightening. But as long as he allowed me to walk, I walked. A large tree appeared before me, probably an oak. Thanks to my father, I knew most of the trees, plants, and animals. Thanks to him for this knowledge. Only because of it, I lasted so long. If I managed to survive, I would definitely thank him for this. From under the ground near the oak, incredibly long and large roots protruded, which I had never seen before. Though, what was there to be surprised about? I was still young and had a lot to see in my life. The roots grew so strangely upwards. It seemed as if they had created a small room for some little gnome out of themselves. I also wanted to know how tall the oak was, but again, the night hindered me. I thought I could hide under the tree roots. They weren't that high. It was very narrow and low, but I still managed to crawl under them. I hugged my knees to warm up, but it didn't help much. Snow still seeped through the roots and fell on me. Fixated on resting, I didn't pay much attention to this at first. Only later did it start to worry me as I began to turn into a small snowdrift. I checked my forehead. The blood had frozen, forming a thin layer of red ice on my forehead. I decided not to touch it anymore or try to scrape off this ice, fearing it would only make things worse. Let everything remain as it is. Gradually, sleep began to take over me. My eyes closed by themselves, and I saw my home. To stay awake, I had to lightly slap my cheeks, but it didn't help much. All my thoughts were only about home, a warm and cozy home, and again, the tears returned. Suddenly, Snow crunched nearby. He was very close to me. I had to hold back my tears so the predator wouldn't hear me. I grabbed my head, pressing my knees to my chin. I rocked slightly from the shivers running through my body. I needed to get out of here. But how? Fear paralyzed me, and my stomach was in turmoil. I could only listen to what was happening around me. Blood ran cold in my veins with every rustle. I could hear the snow crunching under his paws and his heavy breathing. It seemed he was on the other side of the tree, sniffing me out. I hoped my hearing was deceiving me. I had to act urgently. I needed to make a sudden dash for freedom, or I'd freeze to death here or be found by him eventually. I managed to calm down a bit and gather the courage to make this dangerous dash to freedom. As soon as I started crawling out from under my hiding place, I heard a piercing growl nearby. The werewolf growled right next to me, but it seemed he wasn't growling at me but at someone else who had approached. The deafening growl echoed again, much closer this time. Could another beast have come for my soul? And it was likely a large werewolf. I peeked out from under the roots to see what was happening outside, ready to run away immediately. It was indeed a large werewolf of an intimidating size. He approached the oak where the smaller werewolf stood. The smaller one growled angrily and reluctantly, backing away. It was clear he feared the larger one. The larger werewolf approached him decisively. I didn't understand what was happening. Were they deciding who would eat me? As soon as the larger werewolf got close to the smaller one howled and ran away from the oak. I didn't know if this was good for me or not. Now I had to fear not the small werewolf, but the huge one approaching me. Panic gripped me and I crawled back into my hiding place. I closed my eyes and prayed he wouldn't find me and would leave. The snow crunched at my roots, and my heart pounded furiously. He had found me. The large werewolf sniffed greedily around the roots under which I was hiding. Suddenly, unbearable pain shot through my left leg, and I screamed. He had struck me with his paw and then bit into my leg. I howled in pain. He was pulling me out of my hiding place. I grabbed onto the roots to prevent him from pulling me out completely. My fingers clutched the roots so tightly that it hurt. But this pain was nothing compared to the pain the werewolf inflicted on me. But what could a small child, already exhausted, do against a large werewolf? Nothing. I couldn't hold on to the roots for long. He simply yanked me out. The large werewolf dragged me across the ground, and I desperately grabbed at everything I could, even the earth. Gradually, my left leg lost feeling. After dragging me several feet, he threw my exhausted body. I tried to crawl away from him, but he came up to me and slashed my back with his sharp claws. My entire back burned with pain. I had no strength left to scream. Only a slight whimper escaped. My whole body convulsed in agony, and I could do nothing. Now the large werewolf would tear me apart, and that would be my end. The most horrible and painful death awaited me. If I was going to die, I had to die a hero. I turned onto my back and tried to stand up to fight or attempt to escape, even though I knew it was impossible. Just as I started to get up, the large werewolf struck again, this time hitting my face. My right eye swelled shut, and I couldn't see out of it anymore, and my left eye filled with blood. Everything around me took on a new color, a disgusting red. The crimson werewolf approached me, and I was losing consciousness, ready to accept my fate. But unexpectedly, a gunshot rang out in the distance. The werewolf turned toward the sound of the shot and let out his signature growl. He seemed displeased and frightened. The large werewolf decided not to risk it and ran into the forest, just like the smaller werewolf he had driven away. It looked like my salvation. They had found me, and I would soon be home. "Dad, hurry, I feel awful," I whispered. Turning my head to the left, I saw red lights in the distance. They swayed left and right like the pendulum of a wall clock. It seemed they were running toward me, hurrying as fast as they could. I had survived this night. Thank you, Dad, for finding me so quickly. Now all I had to do was get up and walk toward them, and I would be saved. My attempts to stand were painful and unsuccessful. I managed only on the 5th try. All the other times I fell. Once I stood on my feet and maintained my balance, I immediately vomited. I bent over and threw up. Everything was red. Luckily, I didn't lose my balance, or I'd have had to repeat the same actions to stand again. Slowly, I walked toward the lights, wanting to speed up, but couldn't, no matter how much I wanted to. I swayed from side to side, and my left leg was limping, a true torture to step on. My soul sang with joy that the end of this hell was near, and I would be home, seeing my mom. Inside, warmth from the triumph over this forest filled me, and I knew I would never return here in my life. Under no pretext would I come back. It was strange to see everything in a scarlet color, but there was something unusual about it. The lantern lights seemed like small red stars traveling in the endlessly snowy forest, heading right for me. I hoped my body could heal, and my eyes would recover. At least so the left one could see again, but in normal color. With each step, the number of fiery orbs increased. There were about 10. They were getting faster and faster. Maybe 100 yards left and we would meet. Just a bit more, I could handle it. I wouldn't faint on the way to them. Suddenly, I felt a push to the side and fell. Something knocked me over. It felt like someone had jumped on me from the side, knocking me back into the cold snow. I didn't understand what was happening. What had happened? Had I been attacked again? I was so close to salvation, and I was attacked again. Why? To finish me off? My right side was ablaze with new pain. Someone had sunk sharp teeth into me. Unintentionally, I screamed with all my might. The pain was unbearable, still burning in that spot. Turning my head towards the bite, I saw that damn smaller werewolf again. Why had he attacked me again? Why me? Why right when help was near, and in my mind I was already in bed? Unstoppable rage took over. I hit him on the head so hard that he howled in pain but continued to devour my flesh. He began to jerk his muzzle from side to side to inflict more harm, and it seemed like he was going to tear a piece of meat from me. This enraged me even more, that he wanted to enjoy me right before my freedom. I plunged my left hand into the snow, trying to find something to hit him with, while continuing to punch with the other hand. Unexpectedly, he let go of me, but I didn't immediately realize what had happened due to shock and adrenaline. It turned out this abomination had managed to tear my side open. I was furious about this, and I no longer cared about all my pain. Rage and fury controlled me. Feeling something hard with my left hand, I hit the werewolf in the head with it without thinking. The beast staggered. This was an opportunity for me, one I couldn't miss. I quickly pounced on him and started beating him. He continued to resist and fight back. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to gouge his eyes out with my thumbs. The more I pressed, the louder he howled. At that moment, I just wanted him to feel the same pain I had experienced throughout this devilish night. I got carried away and didn't notice he was already dead, but I kept hitting and screaming. It was an incredible pleasure, sweet revenge. At that moment, I remembered my father was close. When I was killing the werewolf, my head was in a fog, and I forgot about it. Looking up, I saw the large werewolf standing before me, apparently unhappy with all this. Why had he come here? This fight I could no longer win. He growled and moved toward me. Like under the roots, I closed my eyes, not wanting to watch as he attacked and devoured me. But then 2 shots rang out, and the large werewolf fell like a rag doll. It was Dad and other hunters. They had found me just in time. I was happy. "Oh my God, son. What happened to you? Don't be afraid, you're safe now. And you'll be home soon." Dad's voice trembled. I saw his face through the red haze and noticed his eyes were teary. "I'm so glad, you foe." I fell forward, and the last thing I saw was the poisoned moonlight. The clouds had cleared, and the birds had flown away, leaving only the stars illuminating us along with the moon. When I opened my eyes, a bright white light blinded me. To my surprise, both eyes could see, which made me incredibly happy. I lay on a bed, but it wasn't mine. Looking around, I realized I was in a hospital. My parents slept nearby, huddled together on chairs. Unintentionally, I smiled. I couldn't believe I was completely safe and that the nightmare was over for me, a small boy. I tried to wake my parents, but my voice was gone, and my body ached so much and was so weak that I couldn't even lift my hand. I waited for one of my parents to wake up, but while they slept, I watched them with a smile and warmth in my heart. They had probably not left my side and hadn't slept all this time. I didn't know how long it had been since I ended up here. I think they hadn't slept for at least a day, but I was willing to wait as long as needed, as long as they got their rest. They had suffered just as much as I had. I didn't have to wait long. My mom was the first to open her eyes. Her face lit up with happiness, and tears immediately began to flow. This woke up my dad, who had the same reaction. They jumped from their chairs and rushed to embrace me. Mom kissed me several times. "Son, I'm so glad you're okay. You're the strongest boy in the world. You survived alone in that dark forest," she cried, her voice choked with tears. "I was so afraid of losing you. Dad, I'm so sorry for everything that happened," I whispered, struggling to speak. "It's not your fault. I was the one who wandered off." "No, it's my fault," my dad cried out. "If I had been more attentive, this wouldn't have happened. If you hate me, I'll understand. I love you more than my own life. Please forgive me." At first, I blamed my dad, but he wasn't at fault. I was the only one to blame for this tragedy. I was deeply ashamed that my father was blaming himself for it. "No, Dad, you're not to blame. It's all my fault. If I had talked to you and not drifted into my thoughts, you would have noticed my absence immediately. And if I hadn't gone after that deer, none of this would have happened. Please don't blame yourself," I managed to say with great difficulty. It seemed to me that I had spoken loudly, but in reality, it was a quiet whisper. 6 months passed, and I was almost fully recovered, though I still had to use a cane because my leg hadn't fully healed, and I limped a bit. We moved away from our home near the forest so no one would remind us of that horrible incident. Now we lived in a small town in Alaska. and I was still getting used to city life. I thought I could handle it soon enough. It seemed easier than surviving in a forest where local inhabitants tried to kill you. Only Dad still found it hard to live in the city and work at his new job since he had been a hunter all his life. But I believed with all my heart that we would be fine. The only thing that still scared me was the nightmares. Every time the sky covered the moon, I had a nightmare. I relived that night, but with a different outcome, where I was devoured alive. Each time I woke up drenched in sweat and trembling, hiding under the blanket. At first I screamed in my sleep, and my parents would rush to check on me. But in the last 2 months, I stopped screaming and now just woke up abruptly from the dream. I hoped that over time it would stop, and a normal, peaceful life would come for me and my parents.
Story 3.
My name is John Harper. I'm a truck driver. At first glance, the job might seem simple. Sit behind the wheel, turn on some music, and hit the road. But it's far from that. Every day is a battle. A battle with fatigue, with bad weather, with clueless drivers who don't understand that a truck is not a car and can't stop on a dime. You have to stay focused every minute, every second. One moment of inattention and you're on the shoulder, or worse, you've crashed into someone. You sit behind the wheel for 10, sometimes even 15 hours a day. Your back aches, your hands go numb, and your eyes water from the strain. But you can't stop. Deadlines don't wait, and the cargo must be delivered on time. One mistake, and you could be in an accident. And an accident in a truck is almost always a catastrophe, and big financial losses. Today I received a new assignment. The cargo needs to be transported through the desert regions of West Virginia. The dispatcher said it was very important, and that the delivery time was limited. I've heard these words hundreds of times, but this time something in his voice was unsettling. He mentioned that the roads there were old and barely passable. I nodded, took the documents, and set off. Work is work. The trip was going to be long, and it started during the day. After filling the tank to the brim, I hit the road. The sun was blazing, the asphalt was melting under the wheels, and it seemed there was no escape from the heat. I always preferred night trips, but this time I had no choice. My thoughts returned to past experiences of driving in these parts. Virginia is not the most pleasant place for a trucker. The roads here are winding, often unpaved, and the navigator doesn't always help. I remember once being stuck here for 3 hours, trying to get out of the mud after a heavy rain. That's when I realized these places could be a real test. Fortunately, nothing unusual happened along the way. I drove hundreds of miles and everything was going according to plan. Cars became scarcer, and soon I found myself in deserted areas. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in bloody red and orange hues. The silence around was almost deafening. No sound, no movement. The asphalt under the wheels became uneven, and I slowed down a bit to avoid the jolting. The barely noticeable vibration transmitted through the steering wheel to my hands, intensifying the feeling of fatigue. I felt my eyelids getting heavy, and my thoughts started to blur. And then I saw it. A silhouette hiding in the bushes by the side of the road. Although the sun had not yet set, the light was already dim, but I could make out the creature. It resembled a human, but was covered in thick fur. My heart sank to my feet, and my hands involuntarily gripped the steering wheel tighter. Startled, I braked sharply, and the truck slowed down, almost coming to a stop. The creature didn't move, as if frozen, watching me. My eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a beast, half human, half animal, with eyes glowing in the twilight. Terror gripped me. Cold sweat ran down my back, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We locked eyes for several long seconds before it swiftly disappeared into the tall bushes. I was left alone on the deserted road in silence, only the faint echo of my breathing filling the cabin. What was that? Could it be that fatigue was playing a cruel joke on me? My eyes, tired from the long road, could have deceived me. Trying to calm my shaking hands, I took a deep breath and decided it was just my imagination. It was probably just fatigue combined with the desire to reach my destination. I started the truck again and continued my journey, but a sense of unease remained in my soul. What if it wasn't just a vision? The places became more and more remote and deserted. The road, narrow and unlit, stretched into nowhere. The trees stood so close that their branches almost touched the cabin of my truck. Suddenly, the signal disappeared. My phone showed only one bar of signal before it completely cut off. The navigator froze, no longer updating the route. This was the last thing I needed right now. I was already getting tired, and the thought of having to find my way blindly added to the stress. Everything piled up. First, that monster, then the lost signal, and now this remote area that seemed to be torn from the world and abandoned here, far from civilization. I felt that I could no longer continue in this state. I needed to stop and rest for the night to avoid risking an accident from fatigue. After driving a few more miles, I saw it. A strange house by the side of the road. It stood alone, as if waiting for someone. The house looked old, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows, boarded up in places, seemed like empty eye sockets watching my every move. The roof was covered in moss, and around the house grew thick grass and shrubs, giving the impression that it hadn't been visited in a long time. Despite the abandonment, a light was on in one of the windows. It was strange and a little scary. Was someone living in this house? Or was it just a ghost from the past? I slowly drove up to the house and turned off the engine. Silence surrounded me, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Fear and uncertainty crept in. I stood before the strange house, feeling the weight of fatigue and thirst pressing on me. I had run out of drinking water, and I hoped that someone lived in this house and could help me. Approaching the porch, I noticed the steps creaking underfoot, and the veranda itself covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. The weathered walls of the house looked as if they hadn't known fresh paint in years, and the windows were dark, seeming like empty eye sockets watching my every step. I knocked on the door. No response. I knocked again, a little louder. Still silence. I began to think the house was indeed empty, but after several long seconds, the door creaked open, and an old woman appeared on the threshold. She looked worn out, with deep wrinkles cutting through her face like a map of life. Her eyes were cloudy, but still held some spark of life. She wore a simple dress and an old apron. In her hand, she held a kerosene lamp, the light of which cast flickering shadows on her face. "Good evening," I said, trying not to look scared. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm lost, and I've run out of drinking water. Could you help me?" The old woman looked at me carefully, as if evaluating whether she could trust me. Then her face softened and she nodded. "Of course, dear. I'll give you some water and show you the way. Come on in. Don't be shy." She stepped aside, letting me in. I entered, trying not to notice the creaking floorboards underfoot. Inside, the house was as old as the outside. The furniture looked shabby, the walls decorated with faded floral wallpaper. In the corner stood an old fireplace, with embers slowly burning. The air smelled of dust and something else, elusive but unpleasant. "Sit down," said the old woman, pointing to an old wooden chair. "I'll bring you some water." I sat down and looked around. On the shelves were old photographs in frames, books with frayed spines, and numerous trinkets. Everything looked as if time had stopped here decades ago. The old woman returned with a pitcher of water and a glass. She poured the water and handed it to me. "Thank you very much," I said, feeling the thirst begin to subside. "You are very kind. Could you tell me how to get to the nearest town?" She nodded again and began to explain the way, her voice calm and measured. "Drive down this road for about 5 miles, then turn left onto an old dirt road. Another 10 miles and you'll reach the highway. There's a town there." I thanked the old woman for the water and the help, returned to my truck, and continued my journey. As she said, I drove a few miles, but the weather suddenly changed. The sky darkened, a strong wind blew, and soon thunder struck. Heavy rain started turning into a downpour, and I realized the situation was becoming serious. I hoped to make it onto the highway before the weather worsened completely, but my hopes were dashed. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and I was forced to drive slowly, barely making out the road ahead of me. Water lashed against the windows, the headlights barely penetrated the dense curtain of rain, and I had to muster all my skills to stay on the road. Thoughts of stopping and waiting out the storm started to cross my mind when I saw a light in the distance. It was faint but noticeable, piercing through the rain and darkness. Thinking it might be another house or shelter, I headed towards it. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my heart pounded from tension and exhaustion. I slowly approached the light, only to realize something was wrong. The light grew brighter, and suddenly I realized I was back at the same house. To my surprise and alarm, I was standing in front of the same old house where I had recently drunk water and asked the old lady for directions. The wind howled, thunder shattered the silence, and rain drummed on the roof of the truck. This wasn't just strange, it was eerie. How could I end up back here if I had been driving straight, following the old lady's directions? A sense of unease washed over me, making me doubt the reality of what was happening. It seemed as though the house was luring me back, knowing I had nowhere else to go to escape the storm. I sat there, staring at the old house, and suddenly the door opened. The old lady stepped out, holding the kerosene lamp. She noticed me and started waving, inviting me inside. I hesitated, but the storm was intensifying, and common sense told me it was better to seek shelter than stay outside in the pouring rain. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, cursing myself for my cowardice. Grabbing my bag and steeling myself, I dashed to the house, getting soaked to the bone in seconds. The door closed behind me, and I found myself in the corridor. The old lady greeted me with the same kindly smile as before. "Bad weather," she said, shaking her head. "Terrible storm. It's good you're here again." "Yeah, the rain's pouring down and I can hardly see the road," I replied, shaking off the water. "Could I stay here for the night?" "Of course, dear. You can't drive in weather like this. Stay with us and continue your journey in the morning." The old lady gestured invitingly. "Come, I'll show you your room. It's upstairs." I agreed, realizing I had no other choice. The old lady led me through a narrow corridor lit by the dim light of the kerosene lamp. The walls were adorned with old photographs, faded from time, and ancient paintings. Dust and a musty smell lingered in the air, creating the feeling that I had stepped into a house from the last century. We climbed a creaky wooden staircase, and the old lady stopped in front of one of the doors on the second floor. She opened the door and gestured for me to enter. "Here's your room," she said with a smile. "If you need anything else, just let me know." I stepped in and looked around. It was quite cozy, though modest. A small bed with an iron headboard stood against the wall, with a little table and chair beside it. The window, covered with heavy curtains, looked out onto the backyard. An old wardrobe stood in the corner of the room. "Thank you very much," I said, turning to the old lady. "This is much better than being outside in such rain." "I'm just cooking dinner," the old lady said, smiling gently. "You're welcome to join us. The food will be ready soon." I nodded in agreement and she left, leaving me alone in the room. After unpacking and changing into dry clothes, I felt a sense of relief. I went downstairs and headed for the living room. It was spacious but filled with antique furniture. Bookshelves filled with old volumes lined one wall. On the other hung paintings in heavy wooden frames. A large fireplace with a quietly smoldering fire created a cozy atmosphere despite the storm raging outside. In the middle of the room stood a long wooden table covered with a tablecloth. On the table were simple dishes: soup, stewed meat, bread, and fresh vegetables. My attention was drawn to a figure sitting by the window in a wheelchair. Wrapped in a blanket, with an old hat on their head, the figure sat motionless, staring out the window, paying no attention to me. The old lady entered the living room carrying a tray with hot dishes and set it on the table. "Please have a seat, dear," she said, pointing to an empty seat at the table. "This is my grandson. He can't walk and often sits by the window. Don't mind him. He just likes to watch the outside." I felt a bit nervous, but fatigue and hunger took over. I sat at the table and began to eat, feeling the warm food restoring my strength. The old lady sat across from me, watching attentively as I ate, as if making sure I liked everything. "Thank you for dinner," I said when I was full. "It was very delicious." "I'm glad you liked it," she replied, smiling again. "We don't often have guests, especially in such weather." I nodded, trying not to look at the motionless figure in the wheelchair. The room became cozier, and the warmth of the fireplace relaxed me. But the strange feeling still lingered. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "Please rest, dear. If you need anything, just let me know," the old lady added, standing up from the table. "Good night." But before she left, I decided to ask one more question. "Excuse me, how long have you been living here? What do you do?" The old lady paused, thinking for a moment, and then sat back down at the table, beginning to tell her story. "Oh dear, I've been living here for over 50 years. This house belonged to my husband. We moved here right after our wedding. Back then, this was a thriving place, not a forgotten corner." She sighed, her eyes sparkling with memories. "There used to be a small village nearby. Henry, my husband, worked on the railroad, and I was a school teacher. In those days, being a teacher was important but thankless. Parents were struggling to make ends meet, and children often lacked the necessities. But I loved my job. Seeing children grow, learn, and become individuals meant everything to me." She paused and then continued. "Our 3 children were born in this house. Life was hard but happy. We raised them, worked hard, and took care of our little farm. When the children grew up, they moved to different parts of the country. Our eldest son became a doctor, the middle one an engineer, and our youngest daughter an artist. They rarely visit, but we keep in touch." Her voice wavered slightly, and she fell silent again. "The grandson you saw is my daughter's son. His name is Thomas. A few years ago, he had an accident and is now confined to a wheelchair. I brought him here because it was hard for my daughter to care for him in the city. It's quiet and peaceful here, and it's easier for him." She looked at me and smiled sadly. Gradually, the village started to empty. People left in search of a better life. Shops closed, the school shut down, and soon no one was left. I continued living here, taking care of the house, tending to the farm, and helping Thomas. Now this house is all I have left. Her story was filled with pain, but also warmth. I felt that behind these simple words lay a deep story of love, loss, and survival. "That's an impressive story," I said, feeling genuine respect for this woman. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for listening, dear," she replied. "Go to bed. Tomorrow is a new day. I hope the weather improves, and you can continue your journey." I thanked her again and returned to my room, feeling the fatigue finally taking over. Thoughts about the oddities of this house and the old lady's story swirled in my head, but I decided that everything would become clearer in the morning. For now, I could only lie down and hope that the night would pass peacefully. I was woken up by a noise downstairs. The room was pitch dark, and the light was off. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight to illuminate the way. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline kept me on edge. Slowly and carefully, I went down the creaky stairs, trying not to make a sound. I called out to the old lady, but no one answered. The silence was oppressive, and I decided to inspect the house to understand what was happening. Entering the living room, I saw that the figure by the window was still sitting motionless, just as before. It was the same grandson in the wheelchair staring out the window. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of unease. Something about this scene was unnatural. When I got closer, the flashlight illuminated the figure's face, and horror washed over me. Sitting in the chair was not a living soul, but a life-sized wooden doll. Its glass eyes stared straight ahead, and its mouth was slightly open, creating a ghastly impression. I recoiled, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just eerie, it was revolting. My hand trembled, and the flashlight beam darted around, illuminating other corners of the room that now seemed even more sinister. Trying to calm myself, I took a deep breath and looked around. Thoughts raced through my mind. Why had the old lady lied? What kind of macabre game was being played here? My instincts screamed at me to run, but I decided to investigate. I called out to the old lady again, but still no answer. I continued my inspection of the house, trying not to miss any details. Opening the door to the kitchen, I entered and shone the flashlight around. The kitchen was old-fashioned, with wooden cabinets and tables covered with faded tablecloths. On the shelves stood old pots and pans, and in the corner was a stove, with a fire still flickering. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and stale food. As I looked around, my eyes caught sight of a small door in the floor, leading to the basement. My heart pounded faster, and I decided to check what was down there. Opening the door, I saw steep wooden steps leading down. The flashlight illuminated the way, and I cautiously began to descend. The air in the basement was damp and cold, and the smell grew increasingly unpleasant. At the bottom, I saw shelves lined with jars of preserves and other canned goods. The walls were lined with brick, and the floor was covered with old wooden planks. But when I looked closely, my heart froze in my chest. In the far corner of the basement stood large glass tanks filled with murky liquid. I approached to see what was inside and nearly fainted. Floating inside were human limbs, arms, legs, heads. The sight was horrifying and unnatural. Terror gripped me, and I was about to run when I heard a faint sound. I shone the flashlight towards the noise and saw a bound girl in the corner. She was unconscious and mumbling something. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her clothes torn. I couldn't leave her there. I quickly ran over and began untying the ropes that bound her hands and feet. The girl's skin was cold to the touch, and I realized she urgently needed help. "Hold on," I whispered, trying not to make any noise. "I'm getting you out of here." Lifting her in my arms, I slowly and cautiously carried her upstairs, constantly looking around, fearing an attack. The storm outside was still raging, but I knew we couldn't stay here any longer. When we reached the truck, I gently placed the girl on the back seat and quickly got behind the wheel. Starting the engine, I glanced back at the house, feeling fear and adrenaline surge through me. That creepy house and its dreadful secrets were behind us, and ahead lay only the road and a hope for salvation. I drove onto the highway, praying the engine wouldn't fail me now. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I sped away from that horrible place, not looking back. We drove down the highway, and the girl was still unconscious. She was muttering something, her face pale and her breathing weak. The bad weather persisted, and visibility was poor. Rain poured down in torrents, the wipers barely keeping up with the deluge, and the wind buffeted the truck. But I kept driving, not slowing down, trying to reach a safe place as quickly as possible. After several miles, I suddenly noticed a light ahead. As I got closer, my heart clenched in terror. It was the same house we had just left. Something inside me twisted with fear. Was this happening again? How was this possible? I slowly approached the house, and dread gripped me as I realized it was indeed the same house. Its familiar outline and windows with dim light induced a panic. I didn't stop, and turning around, drove forward, hoping to escape this nightmare. But after driving a few more miles, the house reappeared in front of me. I felt cold sweat trickle down my back, and panic began to take over. Something was wrong with this place. Terribly wrong. It felt like we were trapped with no way out. I continued driving forward, but each time after a few miles I saw the same house in front of me. It repeated over and over. Each time I saw it, my fear intensified. The girl on the back seat still mumbled something unconsciously, and I felt helpless in the face of this horror. Suddenly she began to come to. Her eyes slowly opened, and she tried to focus her gaze. She was disoriented and weak, but gradually started to realize her surroundings. "Water, please," she whispered, struggling to form words. I quickly grabbed a bottle of water and handed it to her. She took a few greedy sips, then began to cry, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Where am I? What's happening?" she asked, trembling from fear and weakness. "You're safe. I found you in the basement of a house," I began, trying to speak calmly. "I was driving down the road when I stumbled upon this house. I met an old lady who offered shelter. Then I heard a noise in the basement and found you there, tied up." She looked at me with horror and despair in her eyes, then noticed that we were approaching the same house again. "It's useless," she whispered, looking at the house that had reappeared before us. "We can't get away from here." She sighed, and gathering her thoughts began to tell her story. "My name is Lisa. My friends and I were on a trip. We were having fun, and nothing foretold trouble. We accidentally came across this house and decided to stop to ask for directions and rest a bit. The old lady seemed friendly, and she invited us to dinner. We agreed because it was late, and we were tired." She paused, her voice trembling. "After dinner, the nightmare began. We tried to leave, but every time, just like now, we returned to this house. It felt like we were trapped. Then the hunt began. At night, some creature like a giant wolf or dog attacked us. We tried to run, but our chances were slim. We ran out of gas and had to hide in the forest." Her eyes filled with tears, and she continued, "Almost everyone was killed. We were panicked, helpless, and cornered. I was captured and locked in the basement. I thought I would die there, with no chance of rescue." A chill ran down my spine. The creature I had seen earlier now had context, and terror gripped me anew. We drove up to the same house again. My skin prickled as I remembered what was stored in the basement. Those horrible glass jars with human limbs filled me with new fear. But we couldn't just sit idly by. We had to do something. Why couldn't we escape? Maybe it was black magic or something else. I was ready to believe anything. But if we didn't figure this out, we would die. "We need to explore the house again," I said, trying to sound firm. "Maybe we missed something. There might be a way out." Lisa nodded, her face full of determination despite the fear. We got out of the truck, moving quietly and carefully. The rain was still pouring, and the wind howled as if the house itself was calling us back. We approached the door and, trying not to make any noise, carefully opened it. The house greeted us with an eerie silence. We stepped inside and began to explore. I held the flashlight in one hand and Lisa walked beside me, inspecting every detail. We started with the living room. My flashlight illuminated the books on the shelves, old paintings, and the fireplace where the fire was dying out. Nothing new. Then we moved to the kitchen, which looked exactly as I remembered. Wooden cabinets, a table covered with a faded tablecloth, and an old stove. "We need to check the basement again," I whispered, feeling a chill of fear down my spine. Lisa nodded, and we headed to the small door in the floor. I opened it and shone the light down, illuminating the steep steps. We began to descend, and the air grew damper and colder. In the basement, the jars of preserves and canned goods stood as before, but my eyes were drawn to the glass tanks. I felt the same horror as the first time. Lisa froze when she saw the grotesque sight. "What a nightmare," she whispered, her voice trembling. We continued to explore the basement, trying not to miss any details. Carefully inspecting the walls, we stumbled upon a small hole hidden behind a shelf of jars. I shone the flashlight on it, and we saw that it was a narrow passage leading somewhere further. "Look, Lisa, there's some kind of passage here," I said, surprised by the discovery. "Could this be the way out?" she suggested, her voice trembling with hope. We decided to check it out. Moving the shelf aside, we began to crawl through the hole. The passage was narrow and damp, the walls pressing against our shoulders, but we moved forward feeling the air become fresher. We crawled slowly and cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like an eternity, we emerged outside, finding ourselves in the middle of thick bushes. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed like a lesser problem. I stood up, looking around, and noticed that the house was still nearby. Behind it, there was a small shed from which strange sounds were emanating. "We need to check that shed," I said, feeling fear fill me again. We cautiously approached the shed, trying not to attract attention. As we got closer, we peered inside through a small gap in the wall. The sight that greeted us was eerie and strange. In a small chair sat the old lady. She was humming something, her voice quiet and monotonous. On her lap lay a creature that looked like a cross between a human and a wolf or dog. Its body was covered in thick fur, and a long tail was visible on its back. The creature wagged its tail contentedly, listening to the old lady's humming. "That's the creature I saw earlier," I whispered, feeling my heart clench with fear. Lisa pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with horror. "What is she doing?" she asked in a whisper. "It seems like she's somehow connected to that creature," I replied, trying to understand what was happening. We stood there, watching the old lady and the strange creature, when suddenly the creature lifted its nose and started sniffing, as if it had caught a scent. Its sharp ears perked up, and it quickly turned its head in our direction. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we had been discovered. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand. We bolted away from the shed, heading towards the forest. The rain lashed our faces. The ground beneath our feet was slippery, but adrenaline drove us forward. We ran, not looking back, hearing the heavy steps and growls of the creature behind us. The forest seemed endless, trees flashing past our eyes, and I felt my strength waning. The creature was closing in on us, its steps growing louder and closer. We glanced back and saw it was right behind us. "Faster!" I yelled, trying to give Lisa more strength. Suddenly, the creature leapt at us, and I realized we couldn't outrun it. Grabbing a sturdy branch from the ground, I struck it with all my might. The beast snarled and recoiled, but only for a moment. It lunged again, and I hit it once more, aiming for its face. The creature staggered, and we used the moment to keep running. "Come on, Lisa, we have to get out!" I shouted, feeling my strength fading. We kept running, our legs barely moving from exhaustion, but fear pushed us on. The forest grew denser, but I hoped it would help us hide. We heard the creature still chasing us, its breath heavy and menacing. Finally, after a long and exhausting run, we burst into a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. But what we saw made our hearts stop. We were back at the same house. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with despair. I felt a tight knot of fear inside me. We had run for so long, only to end up back at the start. I didn't know what to do next, and panic began to overtake me. We heard the creature approaching again. Its heavy breathing and menacing growls grew louder. We couldn't stay put. We had to run. "To the house!" I yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand. We dashed towards the house. On the porch, we were met with a horrifying sight. The old lady sat in a rocking chair, her face twisted into a mad grin. She held a plate of nuts and laughed loudly as if watching a show. "Well, did you meet my grandson? I hope you liked him," she screeched, her voice like metal scraping on glass. It was a terrifying sight. The kind old lady was gone. Before us was some mad creature. We stared at her in horror, but knew we had to act quickly. Deciding that the house might offer some shelter, we dashed inside and locked the door behind us. The creature slammed into the door, causing it to shudder, but it held firm. Then everything went silent, a sinister quietness settling over the house. We walked around, listening to every sound, and heard scratching at the walls. The creature hadn't left. It was still hunting us. We went into the living room, and suddenly there was complete silence. It was strange, as if the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, the creature leapt out from under the table and attacked me. Its fangs gleamed in the flashlight's beam, and it knocked me to the ground. I managed to grab a nearby chair and used it to hold the creature at bay while lying on my back. It tried to bite me, growling and writhing, its claws scraping against the chair, trying to reach me. I felt its hot breath and saw the fury in its eyes. My strength was fading, but I kept fighting, struggling to keep it at bay. At that moment, I looked up at the ceiling and saw a strange pentagram. It was intricate and eerily beautiful, its lines glowing with a sinister light. I realized it wasn't just a drawing. It might be the source of the power trapping us here. Lisa grabbed a chair and struck the creature with all her might. The creature was thrown to the side, and with great effort I managed to get up. My eyes fell on a kerosene lamp on the table. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and threw it at the creature. The lamp shattered, spilling kerosene everywhere, soaking the floor and the creature. Grabbing a candle, I tossed it into the pool of kerosene. Flames erupted suddenly, quickly spreading to the curtains. The creature howled in pain, its body engulfed in flames. We heard the old woman scream, a sound full of rage and horror. "Run!" I shouted, and we dashed for the exit. Running out of the house, we saw the old woman rise from her chair and come towards us. Her face was twisted with anger. "What have you done to my grandson?" she screamed, heading back into the house. We didn't answer and instead ran to the truck. The flames spread surprisingly fast, thick smoke pouring from the windows, and fire bursting out. The howls and cries of the old woman mixed into a terrifying chorus. I didn't look back to see what would happen next. Turning the ignition, I hit the gas and we sped away. In the distance, the house burned brightly and we prayed we wouldn't be drawn back there. Soon we made it onto the highway, and I realized we had escaped. As soon as we got a signal, we called the police. I don't know what happened next because after I left Lisa and gave my statement, I drove away. I tried to forget everything that happened that horrible night. The images and sounds haunted me for a long time. But I knew one thing. We survived.
Story 4.
In a perplexing maritime mystery that has left investigators and the public alike stunned, the lone vessel known as the Eagle Hauler was discovered in April 1998, adrift off the remote desert coastline of the Gulf of Mexico. This imposing vessel, which had become an eerie symbol of maritime enigma, was famously dubbed a ghost ship due to the absence of any human presence on board. The Eagle Hauler, which was found to be carrying a myriad of containers filled with a diverse array of goods, including consumer products, electronics, and auto parts, left a trail of bafflement in its wake. This seemingly derelict vessel held within its metallic confines an enigma that had eluded investigators for months. The eerie tale of the Eagle Hauler began when it embarked from the bustling port of Hamburg, Germany, just a few months prior to its discovery in the Gulf of Mexico. The ship, its crew of 17 souls, and its valuable cargo had seemingly vanished into thin air a mere week after setting sail from the European port. A massive search effort was launched, but despite extensive efforts, the ship remained elusive, with the whereabouts of the entire crew shrouded in a cloud of mystery. However, a breakthrough in unraveling the enigmatic tale came to light when a diary, meticulously maintained by Dr. John Smith, the ship's esteemed medical officer, was discovered. Dr. Smith was renowned among shipping companies for his professionalism, sharp intellect, and compassionate nature. He was a doctor who left an indelible mark on every ship he served on, earning him unwavering respect and frequent invitations to be part of various maritime ventures. It is from Dr. Smith's own words, as recorded in his diary, that we can begin to piece together the horrifying events that transpired on the Eagle Hauler following its departure from the port of Hamburg. What follows is a riveting account, transcribed from Dr. Smith's diary, of the harrowing journey of the ill-fated ship. September 3rd, 1997. I embarked on a journey that would forever haunt my dreams. The Eagle Hauler, a massive cargo ship, sat silently in the port of Hamburg, waiting to take us into the uncharted reaches of the ocean. The sky above was a dark, foreboding blue, reminiscent of a vast velvet blanket covering our uncertain path. As I stood on the deck, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of tranquility. The crew, a collection of diverse and enigmatic individuals, had gathered to usher in the start of our long and treacherous voyage. I knew some of them by name, faces etched in memory, but not all. Among them was our captain, a man of great repute, Carl McCaw. He was a veteran of the sea, a man who had weathered countless storms and stared into the abyss, his equanimity and wisdom evident in every line etched on his face. My introduction to Captain McCaw was a memorable one, taking place at one of the raucous sailors' parties that seemed like a distant memory now. He had a magnetic presence that drew people to him, and after that unforgettable evening, he had extended an invitation to me to join his crew. At the time, I thought it was a good deal. The rest of the crew, a motley assortment of characters, remained shrouded in mystery. I knew I would have the duration of this voyage to unravel the enigmas that surrounded them. September 4th, 1997 dawned with an air of expectancy aboard the Eagle Hauler. The light of a new day revealed a crew as diverse as the tempestuous sea itself. As we prepared to embark on this journey, the faces of my fellow sailors took on new meaning, each with a different story to tell. Captain Carl McCaw, the steely-eyed master of our vessel, commanded respect and reverence. He was the beacon of our ship, responsible for navigation, issuing commands, and liaising with the port authorities. His wisdom and experience were evident in every word he spoke, a true mariner in every sense. The chain of command extended to First Mate Captain Anna Smith, a woman whose reputation for reliability and exceptional navigational skills preceded her. Second Mate John Reynolds, with his weathered features and a deep well of experience, was always ready to lend a hand at the helm. His dedication to the crew and his unwavering determination made him an invaluable member of our seafaring family. Among the sailors, Luke Jones and Carl Hope were the heart and soul of our crew. Luke's sense of humor was a beacon of light in the often dark world of a long-haul sailor. His laughter was infectious, and his stories of the sea kept our spirits high. Carl, on the other hand, was a bundle of boundless energy, an ever-friendly presence that brightened our days. Below deck, we had the machinists, Michael Brown and Sarah Wilson. Michael, the chief machinist, possessed a silent determination that bordered on grimness. His technical prowess was unquestionable, and in the face of mechanical challenges, he was unwavering. Sarah, his assistant, had an air of quiet confidence about her, a reserve that hinted at a depth of knowledge waiting to be tapped. The stewards and galley attendants, Lisa Martin and David Wallace, ensured that the crew was well fed and cared for. Electrical engineers Alexandra Harper and Daniel Zhao were the guardians of our ship's power. Their technical expertise was crucial, ensuring that our lights and systems continued to function smoothly. Navigators Richard Jones and Allison Carter were the cartographers of our destiny, guiding us through uncharted waters with precision and care. Meteorologist James Smith kept an eye on the ever-changing moods of the skies, offering vital information to Captain McCaw. The meteorologist's predictions often meant the difference between safety and peril on our journey. And finally, shipping agent Linda Wilson, the organizer of all port services, logistics, and financial matters. Her role was very important in making sure our voyages went smoothly. In the depths of the ship, we were joined by fellow longshoremen Mark Stevens and Drake. These two rugged individuals were the backbone of our crew, toiling tirelessly to ensure the cargo was loaded and unloaded efficiently. I had my assistant nurse Natalie with me. We had been working together for quite some time. She is a professional. As a doctor, my role was to know every member of the crew intimately, to be their confidant, their healer. September 5th, 1997, presented itself as a day brimming with both possibilities and curiosities. The crew of the Eagle Hauler remained in good health, leaving me with ample time to delve deeper into the mysteries of our ship. My passion for the sea had only intensified over the years, a burning desire that had led me to the deck of this impressive vessel. As a child, I had dreamt of becoming a ship's captain, but the ironclad will of my father had steered me down a different path, and I found myself studying to become a doctor. Yet, the allure of the open ocean had never left me, and the call of the sea still echoed in my soul. This voyage offered me a chance, albeit in a different capacity, to satisfy my longing for maritime life. My thirst for knowledge led me to explore the Eagle Hauler in great detail. It was a ship that embodied modernity and technology. a behemoth equipped with the latest state-of-the-art systems. I reveled in the opportunity to dissect its inner workings. Our navigation equipment was second to none, featuring GPS systems and electronic charts that ensured precise positioning and routing. Radars and anti-collision systems stood vigilant, constantly scanning the horizon for potential threats and ensuring the safety of our voyage. Automated course control and vessel stabilization systems made for a smooth and efficient journey, even in the roughest of waters. The engine room revealed powerful and efficient engines, their operation overseen by advanced control systems designed to optimize fuel consumption. Computers monitored every aspect of the ship's mechanical systems, their constant vigilance a testament to our commitment to safety and efficiency. The electrical power equipment was equally impressive, boasting power generators with emergency switching and redundancy capabilities to guarantee an uninterrupted power supply. The ship's state-of-the-art communication and navigation systems included radio systems for contact with other vessels and shore stations, as well as satellite communication systems for voice and data transmission in remote maritime regions. Safety remained paramount, with modern firefighting and emergency alert systems in place to protect both the crew and our precious cargo. Tracking and access control measures were implemented to deter unauthorized entry and ensure our ship's security. But what truly left an indelible impression on me was the lifting equipment. Modern cranes, forklifts, and various other devices designed for the efficient loading and unloading of cargo. As I explored further, I even came across automation systems that controlled the ship, including autopilot and energy management systems. It was with a hint of jest that I remarked to Captain McCaw that with such advanced equipment, one might wonder if the role of captain and crew would become obsolete, replaced by artificial intelligence and automation. The captain's response was a grim chuckle, and he cautioned me not to underestimate the power of the sea. The ocean, he said, had a way of revealing its true nature when least expected, no matter how advanced the technology at our disposal. I took his words to heart, sensing an unspoken truth lurking beneath the surface. September 7th, 1997. As the first week of our voyage unfolded, the Eagle Hauler cut through the waters without incident, the vast expanse of the ocean stretching out in all directions. A sense of routine settled over the crew as everyone diligently carried out their duties. The ship's advanced technology hummed in the background, a testament to human innovation and the indomitable spirit of exploration. All seemed well, and there was no sign of impending trouble. However, it was on a dark and eerily calm night that the first tendrils of unease began to weave their way into the tapestry of our journey. Murmurs among the crew members gave voice to unsettling tales of strange noises emanating from the depths of the ship. But it was not just the spectral specters of the night that would disturb our peace. A fortuitous celebration, the meteorologist James Smith's birthday party, brought an unforeseen consequence. James, reveling in the festivities, indulged in more libations than his body could handle. He awoke the next day with a throbbing headache and a gnawing sense of regret. His hangover had clouded his judgment, leading us to overlook the approach of a major storm, a tempest that should have set off alarms. The storm raged with a ferocity that tested the mettle of our ship and crew. The Eagle Hauler was tossed and turned in the tumultuous sea, its massive bulk at the mercy of the elements. We emerged from the maelstrom battered but intact, though the ship bore the scars of the ordeal. The state-of-the-art equipment that had once been our pride now lay in disarray, a broken link to the world beyond. Communication with the shore was severed, a consequence of the tempest's wrath. The captain, ever stoic, was not one to entertain excuses. He demanded that the problem be resolved with utmost urgency. However, for reasons that remained shrouded in mystery, the ship's cutting-edge technology eluded our grasp. It was either too advanced for our engineers to fathom, or the necessary spare parts for repair were nowhere to be found. The isolation we experienced was growing, the tendrils of the unknown weaving their way into our lives. It was among the loading crew, the men who toiled in the shadow of the cargo, that the most disturbing whispers surfaced. They claimed to have seen a massive, lurking shadow moving among the crates and containers. Their accounts were met with skepticism by the captain, who believed that fatigue and fear could play tricks on the mind. However, for the sake of safety, he ordered a vigilant watch over the ship's cameras and a strict mandate against wandering the ship alone. September 10th, 1997. A somber cloud descended upon the Eagle Hauler in the wake of the relentless storm. Days blurred into one another as we navigated the unpredictable waters of the Atlantic Ocean, each sunrise and sunset a reminder of our isolation. The situation on the ship grew grimmer by the hour, as a pervasive sense of unease took hold. It was a few days after the storm when a disquieting revelation struck the heart of our already troubled crew. The news swept through the ship. Agent Linda Wilson was missing. She hadn't been seen in days, and her absence was marked by untouched items in her quarters. Linda was last seen leaving the mess hall, her figure slowly disappearing into the darkness. Concern etched lines on Captain Carl McCaw's face as I approached him, seeking answers to the disquieting mystery. "We've looked everywhere for her, John," he confessed, his voice heavy with worry. "No sign of her. It's as if Linda just disappeared into thin air. It's unlikely she fell overboard. I'd even say it's impossible." I couldn't help but question the ship's surveillance system, which boasted an array of cameras. Surely they would have recorded something, shedding light on Linda's disappearance. But Captain McCaw's response was disheartening. "The storm wreaked havoc on the surveillance system. Half the cameras are out of commission, and the rest only show static. To make matters worse, our communications are still down. This is unprecedented in all my years at sea, John." Desperation and dread gnawed at the edges of our collective psyche as we grappled with the inexplicable disappearance of one of our own. Within a day of Linda's vanishing, an unsettling discovery was made. Her ID and watch were found abandoned behind a maze of pipes near the engine room. The circumstances surrounding how her belongings ended up there were a haunting enigma. No one had seen anything, and the lack of functional cameras in that part of the ship meant that the shadows held their secrets close. And yet, it will remain a strange, terrifying dream. Soon, according to our itinerary, we must complete this journey and reach the port of New York. September 14th, 1997. Our voyage across the vast expanse of the ocean continued without an end in sight. The journey had become an interminable stretch of time, and the arrival in port, which should have occurred days ago, remained elusive. A heavy shroud of uncertainty enveloped the ship, a palpable tension that infected the crew. The silence of the captain, Carl McCaw, hung like a cloud over the vessel, leaving an eerie void where reassurance should have been. The crew, once a cohesive unit, was now a collection of nervous glances and hushed conversations. The anxiety in the air was as thick as the sea spray that lashed our decks. The unanswered question of our prolonged journey loomed large, gnawing at the fringes of my mind. When I sought explanations from the crew, they were as lost as I was. Frustration and fear painted their faces, and they all pointed to the captain and his closest aides for answers. I decided to confront the source of our collective disquiet and make my way to the captain's quarters. But fate intervened, leading me to eavesdrop on a conversation between our first mate, Anna Smith, and the second mate, John Reynolds. Their voices were hushed, their words laden with apprehension. They discussed a navigational error that had led our ship astray. John Reynolds questioned the autopilot's involvement in such a grave miscalculation. He suspected that someone with nefarious intentions had tampered with the system, deliberately altering our course. It was a revelation that sent a chill down my spine. The gravity of the situation struck me, and I understood that they were laboring to restore the autopilot system, attempting to guide us back to our original route. Another disturbing revelation emerged from their conversation: the disappearance of Steward David Wallace. His belongings, they said, had been discovered behind the water supply bay, a bloody testament to an unknown horror. The unease that gripped my heart had deepened into a sense of foreboding that seemed inescapable. Though I had stumbled upon this conversation by chance, I could not remain silent. My duty as a doctor and a member of this crew compelled me to confront the captain and seek answers. When I approached him, Carl McCaw waved me off dismissively, his words laden with an air of reassurance that did little to dispel the pervasive darkness. September 16th, 1997. The descent into darkness on the Eagle Hauler took a malevolent turn. The veil of dread that had wrapped itself around the ship thickened with each passing day. My assistant nurse, Natalie, was the latest victim of this sinister force that seemed to lurk among us. First Assistant Captain Anna Smith, bearing witness to a nightmarish ordeal, reported hearing blood-curdling screams echoing through the hallways. She rushed to the source of the screams, but upon arrival found nothing but an empty, eerie silence. Electricians Alexandra Harper and Daniel Zhao, disturbed by the same cries, joined the frantic search. The trio discovered drops of blood forming a gruesome trail, leading them to a nightmarish scene. Natalie's femur had been torn from her body by unimaginable force, leaving a horrific tableau of terror. The rest of her was nowhere to be found. I wept for my lost companion, for Natalie and I had shared years of service, and her absence left a void in my heart. The realization struck us with a force that threatened to drown us all in a sea of horror. The perpetrator of these atrocities was among us, a silent specter hidden in plain sight. The panic that had gripped the ship was a contagion that spread from soul to soul. As a doctor, I knew the perils of prolonged isolation and severed communication with the outside world. Such conditions could gnaw at the edges of sanity, inviting the abyss of mental instability. I ventured my theory to Captain Carl McCaw, who admitted to sharing my concerns. He proposed a preventative measure, a collective conversation with the crew. In the midst of this nightmarish uncertainty, it was a glimmer of hope. A forum for the crew to share their fears, and perhaps, just perhaps, unveil the face of Natalie's murderer among us. It was a surprising turn of events. The once stubborn captain had conceded his earlier attempts to withhold information, realizing that transparency was our only weapon against the darkness that had enveloped us. September 17th, 1997. The eerie darkness that had enshrouded the Eagle Hauler extended into the early morning. Captain Carl McCaw and I embarked on a grim endeavor, individually calling each crew member for discussions. While I lacked the qualifications of a medical psychologist, my basic knowledge allowed me to pose pertinent questions, recording their answers and scrutinizing their behavior for any telltale signs of disturbance. As the interviews progressed, a disconcerting uniformity emerged. The crew members went about their duties diligently, their composure intact. They had not exhibited any sense of loneliness or despair prior to the spate of disappearances that had cast its shadow over our journey. There was a collective belief that our ordeal would soon come to an end, when we reached port. Hope was a fragile ember, struggling to ignite against the encroaching darkness. However, a recurring theme emerged during these conversations, one that sent shivers down my spine. Many of the crew members insisted they had heard strange, disquieting noises at night. The captain and I had not personally experienced these sounds, but the persistence and consistency of the claims were unsettling. The cargo crew, the captain's aides, and even the meteorologist attested to the eerie cacophony that pervaded the ship after dark. 2 crew members drew our attention, sparking unease within the crew. Drake, one of the cargo crew, maintained that a malevolent black entity stalked the ship, feasting upon the crew in the dead of night. He claimed to have witnessed it and had attempted to share his revelation with others, but they dismissed his words as the ramblings of a terrified mind. Drake's fear was palpable, rendering him a near recluse who cowered within his quarters. We had to convince him, almost forcibly, to join our conversation. The second individual who aroused suspicion was the machinist, Michael Brown. Always reserved and distant from the rest of the crew, he exhibited nervous behavior during the conversation. His statements were disjointed and contradictory, casting a sinister shadow over his demeanor. The captain and I shared our concerns regarding Michael's behavior, recognizing it as a potential lead to uncovering the truth behind the ship's descent into madness. Following the preventative conversations, Captain McCaw and I made the unsettling decision to closely monitor Drake and Michael. Their peculiar behavior and the disquieting claims they had made demanded our attention. September 19th, 1997. The situation aboard the Eagle hauler had spiraled into chaos. It became increasingly evident that the specter of madness had infiltrated our ship, sowing discord and mistrust among the crew. We weren't the only ones who suspected Michael the machinist. Others had noticed his erratic behavior, and Alexander Harper, an electrical engineer, had stumbled upon a disturbing secret. In a bold revelation, Harper disclosed that he had witnessed Michael hiding something within the confines of his cabin. The gravity of this revelation was undeniable, and it led to a fateful decision. Captain McCaw and I took it upon ourselves to investigate Michael's quarters and found some of the missing steward's belongings. Why had Michael hidden this undeniable evidence of his guilt? I could not find an answer to this question. Apparently, traveling by sea had negatively affected Michael's psyche, and he was no longer responsible for his actions. Could not think straight. While the investigation continued within the confines of Michael's cabin, turmoil erupted on the ship. Luke Jones, one of the sailors, descended into a frenzy, intent on delivering a savage beating to the beleaguered machinist. It was a violent outbreak that threatened to escalate into a shipwide lynching, had it not been for the timely intervention of First Mate Anna Smith. In the wake of this chaotic scene, we were left with no alternative but to take Michael into custody. The crew assigned themselves in shifts to guard him, understanding that the darkness that had consumed one of our own could just as easily take hold of others. As we sailed onward, the prevailing hope was that the worst of the ordeal had passed, and the journey to port would proceed without further accidents or disappearances. However, the oppressive atmosphere that had taken root within the ship continued to linger, like an unrelenting fog that obscured the path to salvation. September 21st, 1997. The horrors on the Eagle hauler seemed to possess an insatiable appetite for darkness, as they refused to release their grip on our ship. Luke Jones, the formidable sailor who had once sought vengeance against Michael, had now become the latest victim of the malevolent force that stalked us. Luke was a behemoth of a man, towering in stature and possessing the strength of a titan. In his youth, he had made a name for himself in the brutal world of professional bare-knuckle fighting, It was difficult to fathom who or what could overpower a man of his stature. Panic and desperation ensued as we combed the ship in search of the missing sailor. Our quest ended in a gruesome discovery that sent shivers down our spines. Luke's lifeless body had been reduced to a macabre tapestry of carnage. His once mighty form lay torn asunder, bearing wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by a savage, wild animal. As I examined the gruesome remnants of the man I had known, I couldn't help but entertain the horrifying notion that Drake's ramblings might hold a kernel of truth. Perhaps in the shadowy recesses of the ship, an evil force, something beyond our comprehension, was lurking. Michael, the machinist who had been under close surveillance for a full day, was now absolved of suspicion. The evidence of his guilt had unraveled, leaving him innocent but still under careful watch. The situation remained dire, and the captain and I grappled with the realization that the malevolent presence among us remained elusive. Trapped in the boundless expanse of the unforgiving ocean, cut off from the outside world and devoid of functioning communication equipment, we were at the mercy of an unseen predator. The surveillance cameras remained dormant, the autopilot malfunctioned, and the ocean's vastness offered no escape. Our tormentor, whether a sinister entity or a cunning individual, reveled in the cat-and-mouse game, savoring the despair that had settled upon the Eagle Hauler. September 26, 1997, marked the descent into a maelstrom of madness and terror aboard the Eagle Hauler. The malevolent force that had been haunting us showed no respite, and the frequency of disappearances escalated to an alarming degree. First, it was the navigators who vanished into the abyss of the ship's corridors. Then the second mate of the captain followed, vanishing without a trace. In the wake of these eerie disappearances, one of the loaders met a similar fate. John, our trusted meteorologist, went missing next, leaving us without the guidance of his expertise. The grim pattern of disappearance continued when one of the electricians, Alexander, undertook a perilous journey to repair the faltering communication equipment. He never had the chance to complete his task, and at the sight of his vanishing, we were greeted with a haunting message daubed in blood upon the walls. Games are over. With each passing day, the crew grew more reclusive, retreating to their cabins in a desperate bid to escape the clutches of the malevolent presence that lurked aboard the ship. The vessel itself had become a labyrinth of fear, devoid of functioning navigational systems and plagued by a malfunctioning autopilot. The captain, once our beacon of leadership, was now lost in a storm of technical malfunctions and panic. Nature itself seemed to have turned against us as we found ourselves ensnared by another raging storm. The tempest howled outside, a malevolent chorus that mirrored the terror that had gripped our hearts. I, too, was overwhelmed by fear, cowering within my cabin, dreading the moment when the unseen predator would come for me. The captain had intended to gather us all in a single room, seeking safety in numbers and the opportunity for collective vigilance. But his plan remained unrealized, for he too succumbed to the relentless tide of disappearances. His absence left us adrift, our once unshakable leader vanishing into the abyss. None of us dared to venture in search of him, weighed down by the looming specter of our own impending doom. It was First Mate Anna Smith and I who summoned the courage to embark on the perilous quest to locate our captain. September 29, 1997. Our quest to find the captain ended in horror. We discovered only a gruesome relic of his presence, a severed head with part of his face gnawed away. The wall beside his remains bore a macabre message written in blood. "Your dessert." The chilling words sent shivers down our spines, and we understood that our tormentor reveled in terrorizing us. First Mate Anna Smith was visibly horrified by the gruesome discovery. and she urged us to heed the captain's plan. Gather all remaining crew members in the common room of the mess hall. Through the radio room, we broadcast the call, hoping to unite all who remained. However, by evening, only 5 of us had braved the gathering. Anna, the previously suspected machinist Michael, second electrician Daniel Zhao, and sailor Carl Hope. The whereabouts of the other crew members remained a mystery, leaving us to speculate whether they were missing or cowering in their cabins, paralyzed by fear. Anna and I recognized the necessity of taking turns on duty, for trust had eroded to the point of near extinction. While I harbored some level of trust for Anna, doubts lingered, particularly in regard to Michael. We wrestled with the disconcerting possibility that the murderer could be among us, or that the enigmatic, unholy entity Drake had warned about was real and lurking somewhere aboard the vessel. Drake himself had vanished, adding another layer of uncertainty to our dire predicament. The Eagle Hauler, once a vessel of purpose, had transformed into a foreboding trap, setting sail on an unknown course. The 5 of us, huddled in the dimly lit mess hall, trembled with fear and paranoia. I clung to my diary as a thread of sanity in the unraveling tapestry of terror that enshrouded us. We had no inkling of how long we could endure this nightmare, but one thing was certain. We were determined not to become the next course in this sinister feast. October 1st, 1997, I was jarred awake by a blood-curdling scream, a sound that sent shivers through my already frayed nerves. In a surreal, nightmarish scene, I witnessed something unimaginable. Zhao, the second electrician, under attack. A dark, massive, and furry assailant tore at his flesh, clawing viciously at his legs. Zhao's agonized screams pierced the air as this monstrous entity dragged him away, disappearing down the shadowy corridor. Panic gripped me as I scanned the room for Anna, Michael, or some semblance of an explanation. Yet Anna was nowhere to be found, and Michael's absence added to the mounting unease. Carl, who sat beside me, seemed in a trance, repeating the word werewolf in a trembling voice. My futile attempts to rouse him and inquire about Anna's whereabouts yielded no response. In a shocking turn of events, Carl abruptly stood, seized a knife, and with a rapid, deliberate motion, slit his own throat. His blood sprayed across my face, an eerie baptism of terror. Stunned and horrified by Carl's inexplicable act, I was temporarily immobilized. It wasn't until Drake materialized seemingly out of nowhere that I was yanked from the grip of shock. He urged me to act, insisting that we had to flee. My initial bewilderment gave way to the sheer urgency of the situation, and I followed him without hesitation. The sole question echoing in my mind was, where is Anna? Drake, my newfound guide in this nightmarish scenario, led me to a hidden technical compartment within the ship. He swiftly opened an iron grate cover, revealing a narrow passage leading downward. My confusion and fear rendered me entirely reliant on Drake's guidance, and I followed him blindly through this labyrinth of pipes and iron beams. After a lengthy descent, we arrived at a concealed chamber that had served as Drake's refuge. Surrounded by bars and metal, this hidden enclave was indiscernible from the outside. However, the true horror lay within, as Drake revealed the mountain of human bones that had amassed over time. The sheer sight of it sent shivers down my spine, and I recoiled in terror. Drake's laughter rang out, an eerie sound that seemed tinged with madness. My instinct was to retreat, as I feared that I had been lured into a trap, and that Drake intended to add me to the grisly collection of remains. However, Drake dispelled my fears, insisting that he harbored no sinister intent. He explained that this chamber was a sanctuary, a haven of safety from the malevolent entities that had laid waste to the ship. Drake's frenzied narrative unveiled a horrifying tale. He claimed that we were situated above the creature's nest, safe because the overpowering stench of decay masked our human scent. He spoke with the fervor of one who had defied these horrors and lived to tell the tale. Drake insisted that he had outwitted these monsters, demonstrating a dark determination to assert his newfound authority. When I inquired about his experiences, Drake cryptically alluded to having seen everything and declared himself the new captain, asserting that his word was law. The realization that my sanity teetered on the brink sent a cold shiver down my spine as the boundaries of reality and nightmarish fantasy blurred in the hellish bowels of the ship. Date unknown time has become an abstract concept. I am adrift in a sea of eternal night. Drake and I spent what felt like an eternity within the confines of our refuge. Days blurred into one another as our provisions dwindled and desperation crept in. It was then that Drake, his sanity waning, attempted to end my life in a futile bid to survive. A brutal struggle ensued, and by some miraculous twist of fate, I managed to thwart his murderous intent. In the throes of despair, Drake experienced a sudden, inexplicable revelation. Whether it was a brush with death or the consequences of dehydration, his mind, for a fleeting moment, regained clarity. His dark intentions evaporated, replaced by a grim determination to venture into the ship in search of sustenance for both of us. With newfound resolve, he departed, leaving me in the confines of our shelter. The hours, days, or perhaps even weeks that followed passed in agonizing isolation. I clung to the bars that separated me from the rest of the forsaken vessel, yearning for Drake's return. When at last a distant noise disrupted the eerie silence, I strained my eyes and ears to discern its source. Slowly, the shapes of two nightmarish creatures materialized, gnawing ravenously on a macabre feast. Drake's lifeless body. Their monstrous hunger satiated, the creatures succumbed to exhaustion, and with haunting transformation, shifted from beast to human. I watched, transfixed by horror and disbelief, as Michael and Anna emerged from the bestial transformation. These monstrous creatures that had haunted our hellish voyage were none other than my former shipmates. Michael stirred first, rousing Anna from her feral slumber. Their whispers sent shivers down my spine, for it was a cruel revelation of evil. Anna contended that I might have leaped into the unforgiving embrace of the open ocean, mimicking the fate of second mate John Reynolds. Michael, on the other hand, said that I was hiding somewhere and by all means he wanted to find me and catch me. That he still really wanted his dessert. A chilling declaration left no room for doubt. Their sinister exchange of sibling-like camaraderie revealed the true extent of the horror that had consumed them. But the most chilling realization of all was that I no longer cared for my fate. In the shadow of death, I found solace in knowing that I had not become the cannibalistic monster's dessert. Last diary entry, Dad. You were right. I should have just worked at the hospital as a regular doctor. In the end, I remained in the hidden compartment, clutching my diary. The ship continued to drift aimlessly, a ghostly vessel carrying the remnants of a crew and the nightmares that had consumed them. The Eagle Hauler, once a symbol of human ingenuity and exploration, had become a floating tomb, a monument to the horrors that lurk in the depths of the unknown. Each creak of the ship's hull, each groan of its structure, echoed with the memories of those who had perished. The specter of fear and madness haunted every corner, and the true nature of the evil that had claimed the Eagle Hauler remained a mystery, an enigma lost to the unforgiving sea. The diary, now filled with the harrowing account of our journey, would remain hidden, a testament to the terror that unfolded. Perhaps someday, someone would discover it and piece together the chilling tale of the Eagle Hauler and its ill-fated crew. Until then, the ship would continue to drift, a ghost ship lost in the vast expanse of the ocean, carrying the weight of its dark secrets into eternity.
Story 5.
My advice to you is always to choose a safe route, even if you're just going to the nearest store or pharmacy. Unfortunately, I chose a dangerous path and barely escaped with my life. This happened last month, and I still don't know what happened to me or how I survived. It all started with an invitation. A colleague invited me to spend the weekend at his country house. It was far from the city, and the road to it was unfamiliar to me. My colleague assured me that getting there was easy and wouldn't take much effort. At first glance, the route did seem simple. Get on the 75th highway, turn left after a few miles at the two hills, and then go straight to the end. I left the city late in the evening and unexpectedly found myself in heavy rain, a hurricane, and a thunderstorm, even though the weather forecast had promised a clear and sunny day. It happens. Everyone can be wrong, I thought, crossing those hills. Visibility on the road was terrible, so I drove slowly. Getting into an accident was not part of my plan. After 2 hours of slow driving, I saw a fallen tree on the road. Another obstacle. I had to detour, and how lucky that there was a turn onto another road right in front of the tree. There were no lights, and the road seemed very old. It was clear that cars rarely passed through it. Part of the road was washed out by water, making it difficult to drive. I was seriously worried about getting stuck in the mud. In the distance, I started to see rooftops. It was already past midnight, and the rain only intensified. Continuing the journey in such weather was impossible, so I decided to call my colleague and inform him that I would arrive in the morning and spend the night in this small town. To my surprise, there was no signal on my phone. I had no choice but to find a motel and call from there. I noticed that this small town literally consisted of one road, along which various buildings and houses were located. Many of them were very old and seemed empty and uninhabited. The entire town was incredibly quiet and gloomy. If it weren't for the lights in the windows, I would have thought it was abandoned. Looking for a motel, I stopped at one house to ask the residents. At that moment, a flash of lightning lit up the road, and I saw a silhouette. It was a tall, pale man with a very long neck and arms, dressed in rags. He quickly jumped back and ran towards the house. All this happened in a split second, and I was a little shocked, but I pulled myself together. I decided that due to poor visibility and fatigue, I saw this person slightly distorted. I drove as close to the house as possible, where I thought the man had gone, and hiding from the rain, quickly ran under the porch. I knocked politely several times and loudly called for the owner, but no one answered. This was strange since the house had lights on. I also saw shadows in the windows and heard footsteps behind the door. The rain was pouring down like a bucket, and I couldn't bear it anymore, so I decided to enter the house without an invitation. I opened the door and went inside. The house was dimly lit and smelled of dampness, mold, and wet earth. I called for the owner again, but there was no answer. I decided to go deeper into the house, bypassing the living room, and ended up in the kitchen. Here it was even darker, with only one lamp on. The atmosphere was very dirty and unpleasant. I noticed a pile of dirty dishes and unfinished food on the table, with cockroaches and ants crawling everywhere. A flash of lightning illuminated the backyard of the house, which was covered with tombstones. It looked like a cemetery. Wait, it really was a cemetery. A chill ran down my spine, but what could I do next? I decided to bypass the house and return to the car. The floor creaked loudly under my feet, and I ended up in a small room that, like the kitchen, was in terrible condition. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, the ceiling was full of leaks, and the floor was smeared with dried mud. I didn't dare go up to the second floor, and deciding that I'd had enough, I began to leave the house. Passing by a door leading to the basement, I heard a noise and stopped. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. I was scared but didn't run away. After thinking for a moment, I decided to see who was making the noise in the basement. As soon as I bent down, something pushed me from behind and I flew down. It hurt, but I pulled myself together and began to look around. The basement smelled strongly of rot. It was almost impossible to breathe. Turning on the flashlight on my phone, I was horrified. I saw something I will never forget, and my blood still runs cold. I saw bones. The entire basement was filled with human bones. But the most terrifying thing was that in the shadows I noticed that same silhouette. A man with long arms. He had a pale, smooth head of unnatural shape, small black eyes, a large, strong jaw, and sharp teeth. This creature was gnawing on something, making disgusting sounds. He suddenly stopped and looked at me, slowly rising. He was over 2 meters tall. I didn't wait for this monster to attack me. I quickly jumped up and ran up the stairs. Behind me, I heard a piercing roar, and when I was already at the front door, he grabbed my leg. I turned around and hit him with a chair I managed to grab. He let go, and I ran outside. The rain had already stopped, and fog covered the ground. Getting into the car, I immediately pulled the handbrake and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw only the old cemetery. No houses, no buildings, just tombstones and these monsters. Tall creatures in rags, silently watching as I moved further and further away. In the morning, I finally reached my colleague's country house. He was shocked to see me. I was all dirty, tired, and with panic in my eyes. I couldn't utter a word. Later, I came to my senses and told him what had happened to me. My colleague said that beyond the 2 hills, there was no small town, only an old cemetery that had long been closed. But according to an old legend, there used to be a small town that burned down with all its inhabitants several centuries ago. Of course, after such a story, I returned by another road and never accepted invitations from this colleague again. Story 3. I am a fool. I did not appreciate what I had. I didn't value my life, neglected my friends and relatives, and the people who sought to help and support me. I was hasty to escape it all. I muttered, my voice blending into the heavy silence that hung over the room. The gloom swallowed the words as soon as they left my lips. Resting my forehead against the cool, damp wall, I let the cold seep into my skin. The monotony of my past life, the repetitiveness of work and return home day in and day out, seemed far away now. It gnawed at me then, a constant rat of dissatisfaction chewing through my sanity. I felt destined for more, for something special, something out of the ordinary. Be careful what you wish for. Right now, I wasn't sure if I'd even live to see the morning. I've locked myself in this room, shrouded in a darkness so thick it feels palpable, almost solid. No one could enter this room but me. My plan was to be safe, but it turned out differently. My breathing became heavy and irregular with fear, and in the darkness, I felt someone else breathing beside me. In that oppressive darkness, someone was breathing heavily and coming toward me. And then I heard her whisper, "What a lovely night." A woman's voice, clear as a bell, eerie in the quiet. My blood turned to ice. My heart pounded against my rib cage like a desperate bird trying to escape a cage. My hand scrambled for the doorknob, and I shot out of the room, out of there, into the night, into the unknown. A year ago, I wouldn't have been in this godforsaken place. A year ago, I was just Tom. Tom with a wife, a mortgage, a secure job, and a life as mundane as it was comforting. But then the divorce happened. It rattled me, shook me to the core. I looked at my life and realized I was unhappy, so I decided to change it. I threw caution to the wind, quit my job, sold my house. I bought a motorhome, a cozy little thing that promised freedom and adventure. My golden retriever, Bucky, was the only piece of my old life I brought along. He was my companion, my friend, my anchor in the storm of change. For over a year, we traveled from the vast plains of Texas to the towering mountains of Colorado, from the sun-kissed beaches of California to the bustling streets of New York. Every new place brought new acquaintances, new experiences, and a chance to earn a little money. I found odd jobs wherever I went, relying on my charisma and easygoing nature. I loved it, loved the novelty, the freedom. I lived for the unexpected, for the thrill of waking up to a different view outside my window every morning, the wind in my hair, Bucky's excited barks echoing around us as we hit the open road. For a while, it was everything I wanted, everything I thought I was missing. The sun was inching towards the horizon when Bucky and I rolled into a small town nestled at the edge of a picturesque forest. It was a place forgotten by time, where the charm of yesteryears still lingered on the peeling paint of the houses and the cobbled streets. My motorhome rumbled into an old gas station, a relic from a bygone era. The building stood there like a lonely sentinel, aged and worn down, seemingly abandoned. But a sign on the door caught my attention. Night shift worker needed. The salary listed was good, better than any odd job I had taken up till now. It was the perfect opportunity to bolster my dwindling budget. An old man emerged from the building, leaning heavily on a cane. His long, thick beard was streaked with silver, a stark contrast against his dark, wrinkled skin. He was very tall, nearly scraping the doorframe as he stepped out, but painfully thin, his old, shabby clothes hanging off his bony frame. He looked stern, almost grim, his eyes guarded. This was Theodore, the owner of the gas station. Our conversation was brief. He introduced himself, outlined my duties, and without further ado, accepted me for the job. He didn't ask anything about me, where I came from, why I was here. It was odd, but I shrugged it off. On the road, I had encountered all kinds of people. Theodore was strange, no doubt, but not the strangest. With my new job secured, I decided to take a walk through the sleepy town. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. The buildings lining the streets were old, quaint, their architectural details hinting at the town's age. There was an unusual calmness. Most people were either at work or confined to their homes. I crossed paths with only a handful of locals. I nodded in greeting, and they returned it with cautious smiles. There were only 2 grocery stores, a testament to the town's slow pace and limited needs. It felt like a bubble, untouched by the rapid evolution of the outside world. Time seemed to have slowed down here, suspended in a gentle sway of nostalgia and tranquility. It was calming, appealing in a way the constant change of the road wasn't. For a man on a journey, a man of movement, the allure of such profound stillness was strange but undeniable. I decided to stay for a few days, soak in the serenity, and replenish my funds. As darkness fell on my first night at the old gas station, I felt an eerie tranquility enveloping me. Bucky sat by my side, his eyes reflecting the glow of the dim gas station lights. We were isolated on the old road with the vast black forest around us. The first hours were uneventful. I went about my duties, cleaning, tending to the pumps, inventorying the sparse merchandise on the shelves. As the hours passed, a feeling of unease began to creep in. The gas station, a charming relic during the day, took on a different aura in the night. The shadows played tricks on the corners of my eyes. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, and every creak of the old building felt like a whisper in the wind. But Bucky was by my side, and his calm presence was comforting. Despite the odd vibes, I brushed it off as first-night jitters. It was past midnight when I saw the lights of a car approaching. An old model, its bodywork reflecting the stories of its years. A man stepped out, dressed in a long coat and a plaid hat shadowing his features. He filled up his car with practiced ease, then walked towards the counter. "Good evening," he greeted, a small smile playing on his lips. His voice was deep and resonant, the timbre of it oddly calming. "Cold today, isn't it?" he said, filling the silent night with his voice. We got talking then, about the weather, about cars, about the landscape around us. He introduced himself as Edward. Edward was a seasoned traveler, a man who had seen the world. His stories were fascinating, his words painting vivid pictures in my mind. He spoke of his travels, how he had journeyed on this road many years ago, how much it had changed, yet how much had stayed the same. His stories were woven with a love for the area, and I found myself drawn into his tales. Throughout our conversation, Bucky behaved peculiarly. He growled when Edward first approached, then retreated behind the counter, whimpering softly. It was unlike Bucky to behave this way, but Edward didn't seem to notice, and Bucky's unease didn't escalate. I dismissed it as my faithful companion being wary of a stranger. As the night grew deeper, Edward left, his old car disappearing down the road. The rest of the night was quiet. The only customers were the stars above and the whispers of the wind. With the first rays of dawn, Theodore arrived. I handed over the night's earnings, a sense of accomplishment filling me. Despite the oddities of the night, it had been a good first shift. The next 2 nights were uneventful. Edward, the lonely night traveler, was my sole patron. His visits were like clockwork, midnight on the dot. Bucky's behavior, however, grew stranger by the hour. He'd whine at the sight of Edward disappearing behind the counter and sometimes refusing to leave the motorhome entirely. He was especially unsettled around Theodore. Their indifference to Bucky was odd. They seemed oblivious to him, not even acknowledging his presence. I tried to reassure Bucky, comfort him, but nothing seemed to work. On the 3rd night, I decided to leave Bucky behind. He whimpered and nipped at my trouser leg as I readied myself for my shift, his eyes full of a fear I couldn't fathom. It was heartbreaking to see, but I felt it best to leave him behind. The night was eerily quiet as I settled in. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional chirp of a cricket outside, they filled the silence, the mundane sounds of an average night. I was in the middle of my cleaning routine when I heard the rumble of a car engine. A vintage pink convertible pulled up, its polished surface glistening under the gas station lights. A woman stepped out, her dress a retro 50s style, her hair coiffed to perfection. She approached the counter with a disarming smile, asking for directions and petrol. As I filled her car, we exchanged small talk. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, an unsettling feeling I couldn't place. Her smile, her laughter, it was oddly familiar. Her invitation to join her on her journey caught me off guard. I declined politely, but her smile never wavered. She left as abruptly as she'd come, her departure leaving an inexplicable void in her wake. The 4th night brought another visitor. Her young face contrasted against her old-fashioned dress. Her eyes held an ineffable longing, She too needed fuel, but there was more to her than a mere need for gasoline. As we conversed, her story unfolded. She had lost her love on this very road in a devastating car accident. She was searching for him, her words filled with the desperation that made my heart ache. She claimed that he often drove past the gas station at night. Others had seen him, but she was always a moment too late. Her tale, though tragic, seemed improbable. Her state of mind seemed shaky, her loss rendering her a bit delusional. After filling her car, she smiled a sorrowful smile, her eyes glazed over with unshed tears. She drove away, leaving me standing there, her story resonating in the silence of the night. A peculiar pattern began to emerge over the next few nights. An increasing number of my customers seemed trapped in a time warp, their outfits reminiscent of bygone eras, their cars vintage models like they had driven straight out of an old photograph. Their interactions were a mixture of mundane and surreal. Some were tight-lipped, their conversations limited to perfunctory exchanges, while others shared anecdotes that made my skin crawl. Stories of missed opportunities, lost time, unfinished goodbyes to their loved ones. I distinctly remember one woman. She was wearing an expensive dress. Her car was an expensive model, luxurious in every sense of the word. Her hands trembled as she recounted her tale. Her family, she claimed, had conspired against her, staging a car accident in a Parisian tunnel to end her life. The fear in her eyes was tangible, her story so wild I was left questioning the line between reality and hallucination. The inexplicability of the events was starting to gnaw at my nerves. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, escape from the enigmatic occurrences plaguing the sleepy town. However, the lure of the generous salary kept me anchored. I reasoned with myself. Sure, these customers are odd, but I'm safe, aren't I? And so I decided to continue my stint at the gas station. Amidst all the chaos, there was one constant: Edward. Like clockwork, he'd pull up in his old car, fill his tank, converse amiably, and leave. The rhythm of his visits was almost comforting, a predictable pattern in the maelstrom of the bazaar. But that night Edward didn't come. An unspoken worry started to gnaw at me. His absence felt significant, an ominous shift in the pattern I'd grown accustomed to. Impulsively, I decided to leave the store and walk down the road, hoping to spot Edward's car approaching. That's when I heard it, a man's voice from behind, as clear as day. "Hey boy, I see you're a real gentleman. Good people like you don't stay long in places like this." The unexpected voice made me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding, but I found no one. For a moment, I thought it was Edward. The voice held the same timbre, the same casual tone, but the emptiness around me made me question my senses. The next evening, a thick fog drifted over the town and the gas station, enveloping them in a dense, wet blanket. As I stood near one of the gas pumps, a woman's voice punctured the silence. "Excuse me, could you check the tire pressure?" I turned sharply, but the fog held its secrets well. There was no woman, no car, just the thick mist slowly swirling around me. A chill spread through my body. The fear was no longer just lurking in the shadows. It was confronting me head-on. Seeing no one around, I decided to retreat into the relative safety of the store. As I turned to leave, a sound pierced the quiet. The unmistakable hum of a car engine. It pulled into the gas station, the grind of the tires, the click of doors opening and closing. There was laughter, a murmur of conversation, a tableau of normality painted in sound. Yet when I looked around, I was alone. The gas station was deserted, a stage with no actors. The fear seized me, propelling me towards the store. I raced inside, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding as the locks clicked into place. I was terrified, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Was I hallucinating? Was it the gasoline fumes playing tricks on my mind, or was sleep deprivation finally catching up with me? The unease deepened, wrapping its icy tendrils around my heart. I decided to close the shop and gas station. I needed to get away. As I picked up the keys from the counter, I turned back towards the door and froze. Outside, through the fog-smudged glass, stood a guy. He was in a black leather jacket, his skin pale and stretched taut over his slender frame. His eyes were the most chilling, lifeless, and glassy, straight out of a horror movie. "Full tank, please," he said, his voice a chilling echo in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands shook as I slipped the key into the door, ready to close up. "What are you doing, Tom?" he asked, his words like ice on my spine. He knew my name. I'd never seen him before, yet he knew me. As I locked the door, my gaze drifted beyond him into the fog. The gray was dotted with shadows, shapes of vintage cars and specters of people. They stood silently, watching the store, watching me. Then came a rustle behind me. I turned around, my heart in my throat, to see a young boy standing there with bags of salted nuts. He grinned, his eyes dancing with mischief. He began to speak, but the words were foreign, unintelligible. The fear swallowed me, pushing me to bolt towards the back room. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I fought to catch my breath. My heart pounded in my ears as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. I was caught in a nightmare I didn't understand, and I had no idea how to escape. Shut inside the room, I locked the padlock, the click echoing in the silent space. The only sound for miles, it seemed, was the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe, that the solid door could keep out the strange happenings beyond it. But even as I tried to slow my erratic breathing, the air around me became heavy with the unmistakable sound of someone else's breath. In the darkness, I could hear the labored breathing of another, drawing closer with each moment. An icy shiver crept down my spine, my heart rate increasing in the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the whispering voice broke through the quiet. "Lovely night." Turning around, my eyes barely made out a figure. The woman with sad eyes who had been visiting the gas station. She was looking for her lost love, the one claimed by a deadly car accident. The realization sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, prompting me to leap to my feet. My legs carried me towards the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Bursting out of the room, I found myself face to face with the familiar sight of Edward's car. The sound of its honking horn was like a life raft to a drowning man. Edward was in the car, the window rolled down as he urgently beckoned. "Tom, hurry up! Get in! Don't waste time!" Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, and I found myself running to the car. The door opened with a familiar creak, and I clambered into the vehicle. The moment I was in, Edward pressed down on the gas, the station retreating into the fog as we sped away. Gratitude bubbled within me, and I found myself thanking Edward profusely. Edward glanced at me, his face grim in the dim light. "You're a good guy, Tom, but you shouldn't have worked at that gas station. Get in your RV and drive away before they know where you're staying." His words echoed in the tight space of the car, wrapping around me like a chilling prophecy. But who are all these people, Edward? Why are they so scary? Edward, who are you really? I found myself blurting out, desperate for answers to the riddles that had been plaguing me. Edward, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. The journey to the camper felt much shorter than it should have. As I climbed out of Edward's car, he simply gave me a solemn wave before driving off, his car disappearing into the thick fog that seemed to have grown denser with the break of dawn. I stood staring at the camper door that lay just a few steps away. Bucky's anxious barking pierced through the stillness, a desperate call of urgency. My hand was on the door handle, about to push it open, when Bucky dashed out. He growled low, barking loudly at the surrounding fog before he darted away, disappearing into the shrouded unknown. "Bucky," I called out, my voice strained. The cold mist swallowed the echoes of my cry, returning only a haunting silence. As I strained my eyes through the dense fog, I began to discern looming figures slowly emerging from the misty veil. Their silhouettes grew increasingly distinct as they steadily advanced. They were the people from the gas station, the strange apparitions that had inexplicably marked my existence these past few days. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them draw closer. In the face of the unknown and with Bucky lost in the fog, my instincts screamed at me to heed Edward's advice. I forced my feet to move, carrying me back towards the safety of my RV. The familiar metal under my hands was a grounding force as I clambered into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, pulling away from the enveloping strangeness of the town. Fear was my guide now, a relentless motivator urging me further away from the spectral gas station and its enigmatic customers. My journey continued until I was finally free from the confining fog and found myself on a main road, the forest road now a distant memory in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached the safety of another small town that I allowed myself to breathe again. In this relatively busy township, I was horrified to learn that the old forest road had long since been erased from maps. Even more chilling was the revelation that the sleepy town, the place I had just escaped from, had burned to the ground decades ago, its inhabitants lost to the merciless flames, and the gas station, the eerie hub of my inexplicable encounters, was unheard of too.